Explosions tear through the streets of Berlin as Soviet artillery rains down, smoke choking the sky, and buildings crumbling under relentless bombardment. The final chapter of World War II in Europe unfolds in the heart of the German capital. From April to May 1945, Soviet forces push relentlessly into Berlin, facing desperate resistance from German soldiers and civilians alike. Streets become battlefields, bunkers conceal fierce last stands, and the city transforms into a chaotic maze of fire, rubble, and echoes of gunfire. Civilians flee or hide, soldiers fight with unyielding determination, and the relentless tide of Soviet tanks and infantry gradually crushes the Nazi defenses. Tonight we will take you through the entire Battle of Berlin, from strategic maneuvers and brutal street fighting to the final surrender that signaled the end of Hitler's Third Reich. So settle in, close your eyes, and let this story guide you through the chaos, courage, and collapse of history's deadliest urban battle. In January 1945, the Eastern Front erupted in violence unlike anything Europe had seen before. The Soviet Union, having endured years of devastation, launched the colossal Vistula-Oder offensive, a blow designed to finally shatter the Wehrmacht's crumbling defenses. Over 2.5 million Red Army soldiers surged forward, supported by more than 40,000 artillery pieces and thousands of tanks and aircraft. Against them stood a weakened German army, underfed, understrength, and unable to mount a coherent defense. Hitler had diverted resources to the Ardennes in the west, leaving his eastern forces dangerously exposed. Entire divisions consisted of exhausted veterans, teenagers and old men pulled from the Volkssturm militia. When the Soviet assault began with the thunder of thousands of guns, German lines simply buckled under the pressure. The winter landscape was lit by a wall of fire that stretched for miles across Poland. German units that survived the opening bombardment found themselves cut off and encircled within days. The Eastern Front, long the graveyard of armies, was now collapsing in spectacular fashion. The Vistula-Oder offensive was not merely a military operation, but a thunderous display of Soviet strategic might. It began from bridgeheads on the Vistula River, where Soviet forces had quietly prepared during late 1944 for a decisive push. On the morning of January 12, 1945, the silence broke with a coordinated artillery strike, so intense that survivors compared it to the sky itself collapsing. German defensive lines, already thin, disintegrated under the pressure of shells, Katyusha rockets, and relentless ground assaults. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev commanded parallel thrusts, each competing for speed and glory in the advance. Their men advanced an average of 25 kilometers per day, an almost unheard-of pace on the Eastern Front. Towns that had been German strongholds crumbled within hours, with survivors retreating west in chaos. Soviet armored spearheads exploited every gap, slicing deep into the rear of German positions. Within weeks, the Red Army had surged across Poland, reaching the Oder River, a mere 70 kilometers from Berlin. The collapse was not gradual, it was catastrophic, and it shook the German command to its core. For the German civilian population, the Soviet advance brought terror and confusion. Refugees poured westward in endless columns of carts, bicycles, and whatever vehicles they could find. Bitter winter winds lashed these convoys as they trudged through snow and ice, fearing both Soviet troops and German authorities, who accused them of cowardice. Entire villages were abandoned in panic as rumors spread of Soviet atrocities, some based on truth, others exaggerated by Nazi propaganda. The roads quickly clogged with humanity, livestock, and military remnants retreating in disarray. German soldiers attempting to regroup found themselves swept into the tide of civilians, unable to form effective lines of resistance. Railway stations became scenes of chaos, with desperate crowds fighting for a place on trains bound west. The once unshakable Reich now looked fragile, as its eastern territories dissolved into scenes of collapse and despair. The illusion of Hitler's thousand-year empire lay shattered along frozen roads littered with broken wagons. The Eastern Front was no longer just a military crisis. It was a humanitarian catastrophe on a massive scale. Each kilometer the Soviets advanced deepened the sense of irreversible defeat. The Wehrmacht's command structure during this offensive was riddled with dysfunction. Army Group A, commanded by General Joseph Harpe, simply lacked the manpower and resources to hold the line. Hitler's obsession with no retreat orders trapped divisions in hopeless situations where they were annihilated or forced into chaotic retreats. Panzer reserves were virtually non-existent, with many armored units consisting of just a handful of operational tanks. Communications broke down as Soviet thrusts severed rail lines and telephone cables, leaving commanders blind to the situation. Harpe himself was quickly relieved of command, replaced by Heinrich Himmler of the SS, whose incompetence only deepened the crisis. Orders from the Führerbunker in Berlin demanded counterattacks with phantom divisions that existed only on paper. Officers who suggested tactical withdrawals were accused of defeatism or treason. German soldiers at the front fought with grim determination, but without supplies or reinforcements. Resistance was futile. The very structure of the German command became a liability as the Red Army closed in on the Reich's eastern gates. Soviet soldiers advancing through Poland carried with them not only orders, but memories of what the Germans had done to their homeland: villages burned, civilians massacred, and the horrors of Nazi occupation had left scars that now fueled vengeance. When they reached sites like Marjanac and Auschwitz, they uncovered atrocities beyond imagination: camps filled with skeletal survivors, piles of corpses, and warehouses of belongings stripped from victims. These discoveries only hardened their resolve to push westward with unrelenting ferocity. For many Soviet troops, the war was no longer just about defeating an army, but about punishing an entire system that had wrought devastation across Eastern Europe. Their commanders encouraged this mindset, reminding them of the millions lost to German invasion. Every step deeper into German territory felt like justice being reclaimed at gunpoint, yet it also unleashed waves of violence and reprisal against German civilians. The advance westward became a rolling wave of destruction, propelled by anger as much as by strategy. In the rubble of Poland, the Eastern Front had become both a battlefield and a reckoning. The geography of the offensive played a crucial role in its speed and success. The flat, open plains of Poland provided ideal terrain for Soviet mechanized armies, allowing tank formations to outflank and bypass pockets of German resistance. Frozen rivers and hard winter ground enabled heavy vehicles to move rapidly, unimpeded by the mud that had stalled offensives in earlier years. Engineers worked tirelessly to bridge rivers and repair roads, keeping the Soviet momentum alive. Meanwhile, German forces had no time to create fortified defensive lines, as each fallback position was overrun before it could be solidified. The capture of key cities such as Warsaw, Krakow, and Łódź cut German supply networks to pieces. Rail hubs fell in quick succession, further isolating retreating all forces. The rapid advance shocked even the Soviets themselves, who had expected stiffer resistance. Instead, they found the Wehrmacht brittle, worn down by years of attrition and strategic missteps. The advance to the Oder was not just a triumph of numbers, but of logistical mastery and mobility. Geography and preparation had finally aligned in the Soviets' favor, and the results were devastating for Germany. By February 1945, The psychological impact of the Soviet advance was being felt across Germany. For civilians in Berlin, news of the Red Army's arrival at the Oder River was terrifying, as the front was now within artillery range of the capital. Propaganda broadcasts tried to reassure the public, claiming that miracle weapons or fresh armies would soon appear. In reality, the regime had little left to offer but empty promises. German radio played patriotic songs while underground whispers spoke of inevitable defeat. Hitler himself raged at his generals, demanding counter-offensives that never materialized. The regime began executing anyone suspected of defeatism, from military officers to ordinary citizens. Public squares hosted hangings of alleged deserters, meant to instill fear but instead deepening despair. In homes and air raid shelters, families prepared for the unimaginable war reaching their very doorstep. The once distant Eastern Front was now a looming shadow over every household in Germany. The collapse of the Eastern Front after the Vistula-Oder offensive marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. In less than a month, the Red Army had advanced nearly 500 kilometers, tearing away the Reich's eastern territories and exposing Berlin to direct assault. The speed of this advance stunned the Allies, who had anticipated the war lasting well into 1946. For the German leadership, it was a devastating realization that the Reich could not be saved. The Wehrmacht, once feared as the most formidable army in Europe, was now retreating in tatters. Millions of civilians faced displacement, starvation, and violence as the front devoured their homes. Soviet forces, hardened by years of brutal conflict, pressed on with determination that left little room for negotiation or mercy. Every mile westward brought them closer to Berlin and to final victory. The collapse was not simply military, it was political, social, and moral, a complete unraveling of the Nazi state. The Battle of Berlin was now inevitable, and the Eastern Front's collapse was the overture to the Reich's destruction. By the winter of 1945, Berlin was teetering on the edge of collapse. But Adolf Hitler continued to live in a fantasy of final victory. Inside the subterranean concrete walls of the Führerbunker, Hitler isolated himself more than ever from the reality unfolding across Europe. Reports from the front spoke of Soviet armies pouring through Poland, American and British forces, advancing across the Rhine, and German cities reduced to rubble under relentless Allied bombing. Yet Hitler convinced himself that the Reich still possessed untapped strength, hidden reserves, and the capacity to strike back. His belief was no longer grounded in military analysis, but in sheer delusion shaped by a mix of desperation and megalomania. He envisioned a reversal of fortune that would shatter the Allied advance and restore Germany's dominance. Even as his generals pleaded with him to recognize the hopeless situation, Hitler clung to the idea that history would grant him a miraculous triumph. This refusal to accept defeat would shape the final months of the war in Europe, condemning countless civilians and soldiers to further suffering. Central to Hitler's delusion was the idea of so-called wonder weapons that would change the course of the war. These included the V-2 rocket, an early ballistic missile capable of striking London from the European mainland, as well as jet aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me 262. Propaganda trumpeted these innovations as symbols of German genius, promising weapons that could destroy Allied cities or devastate enemy armies. Hitler became obsessed with these technological marvels, seeing them as the instruments that would rescue Germany from disaster. He demanded that resources be funneled into their production even when the Reich lacked fuel, raw materials, and factories intact enough to mass produce them. Engineers and scientists worked feverishly to satisfy the Führer's demands, yet their efforts could not compensate for the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allies. Still, Hitler spoke of his wonder weapons as if they were magical swords that could slay giants, a fantasy that reassured him in the darkness of impending collapse. These illusions blinded him to the everyday reality of starving German civilians and exhausted Wehrmacht divisions collapsing on the front lines. The wonder weapon myth was more than a military hope. It was psychological theatre for Hitler and his remaining loyalists. As Allied forces advanced, Goebbels' propaganda machine spread stories of secret weapons that would soon be unleashed. Newspapers and radio broadcasts repeated promises of devastating counterattacks and annihilation of the enemy. For the German population, such stories offered a fragile thread of hope in the midst of ruin. For Hitler himself, they became a crutch to support his delusional worldview. He believed that if Germany could just endure a little longer, these miraculous devices would tip the scales of war. The Führer fantasized that the Allies would be forced into negotiation, splitting apart under the weight of their own mistrust, leaving Germany to rise again. This fantasy encouraged Hitler to reject all possibilities of surrender and instead to order continued resistance regardless of the human cost. The myth of the wonder weapon prolonged the conflict at a time when the war was already irretrievably lost. As Hitler's fantasy grew, his relationship with his generals deteriorated further. Field commanders delivered reports of armies broken and divisions destroyed, but Hitler accused them of cowardice and treachery. He lashed out at men who had once been his most loyal officers, dismissing or humiliating them for speaking the truth. The Führer demanded victory or death from units that were already shattered, ordering them to hold cities that had no chance of defense. His military directives became increasingly detached from reality, more the product of wishful thinking than any strategic logic. He believed that the Soviets would exhaust themselves in the final assault, and that somehow, against all odds, Germany's exhausted armies would emerge triumphant. This irrational command structure created confusion and despair within the Wehrmacht, as officers struggled between obeying suicidal orders and facing the wrath of the Führer. In this poisonous atmosphere, discipline crumbled, but Hitler's fantasies only grew stronger. Hitler's obsession with victory was also tied to his refusal to acknowledge the human suffering of his own people. As Berlin and other cities lay in ruins, civilians faced starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment. Yet Hitler insisted that sacrifices must continue, proclaiming that German blood was the price of national destiny. He mocked the idea of negotiation or surrender, arguing that such actions would betray the sacrifice already made. The lives of ordinary Germans meant little to him compared to his dream of a lasting Reich. Women, children, and the elderly were pressed into the Volkssturm militia, forced to carry rifles against Soviet tanks. Propaganda told them they were part of a sacred final stand, even as their deaths became certain. For Hitler, the destruction of Germany itself was preferable to capitulation, and he imagined a phoenix-like rebirth rising from the ashes. This ruthless fanaticism sealed the fate of millions and prolonged the agony of a war already lost. In Hitler's fantasy, the Western Allies were not truly united with the Soviets. He believed that the Americans and British would inevitably break with Moscow, turning against Stalin in a new global conflict. If Germany could hold out long enough, he imagined that Berlin would become the indispensable bulwark against Bolshevism. Hitler envisioned himself as the last line of defense for Europe, forcing the Western powers to recognize his importance. This was not a carefully considered diplomatic strategy, but a delusion built on his own paranoia and wishful thinking. By 1945, Roosevelt and Churchill were already committed to unconditional surrender, but Hitler convinced himself that their alliance with Stalin was fragile. He believed time was his greatest ally, even as time was rapidly destroying everything around him. The fantasy of Western betrayal of the Soviets allowed Hitler to reject all peace proposals and continue fighting to the bitter end. The deeper Hitler sank into fantasy, the more destructive his orders became. He demanded that German infrastructure, factories, bridges, railroads, and even farms, be destroyed so that nothing could fall into Allied hands. This Nero decree, named after the Roman emperor, who supposedly burned his own city, condemned millions of Germans to further misery. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, resisted many of these orders, secretly sabotaging the destruction to preserve what remained of the nation. Yet the decree symbolized Hitler's final descent into madness. If Germany could not win, then Germany did not deserve to survive. This apocalyptic worldview revealed how far his dreams of glory had warped into dreams of annihilation. The wonder weapons, the fantasies of alliance shifts, the refusal to surrender, all were now interwoven with a death wish for the Reich itself. In the end, Hitler's fantasy of victory was nothing more than a cruel illusion, one that prolonged destruction and human suffering. From the bunker in Berlin, he spoke of divisions that no longer existed, counterattacks that were never launched, and weapons that could never be produced in time. His words still carried authority over the remnants of the Nazi state, binding his followers to his dream even as the Soviet guns grew closer. Hitler's refusal to acknowledge reality trapped Germany in a final spiral of destruction. Soldiers continued to fight, and civilians continued to die for a victory that could never be achieved. The fantasy sustained him until his last days, when even the sound of Russian artillery could not pierce his delusional hopes. It was a tragic testament to the power of belief divorced from truth, and it ensured that the last chapter of Nazi Germany was written in fire and blood. By the beginning of 1945, as Soviet armies pressed ever closer to the German capital, Adolf Hitler declared Berlin a fortress city, a place that would supposedly stand to the last man in defense of the Reich. This decree, issued with dramatic flair, transformed the once proud metropolis into a battleground in waiting, with orders that not a single street or building was to be surrendered without a fight. The term fortress carried heavy symbolism, evoking images of impenetrable medieval strongholds, but the reality was far more grim. Berlin was not a fortress of thick stone walls and endless supplies, but rather a city already scarred by bombing raids and filled with exhausted civilians. Hitler's order was less a military strategy and more an act of desperation, a way to project strength at a time when the Reich was collapsing. As resources dwindled, civilians were pressed into service, from old men to schoolboys, to hold back the might of the Red Army. The propaganda machine painted a picture of noble sacrifice, of ordinary Germans ready to defend their homes with unmatched courage. Yet beneath the rhetoric, many Berliners knew they were being condemned to destruction. The declaration of Berlin as a fortress symbolized Hitler's refusal to acknowledge defeat, forcing the city to pay the ultimate price. And in the weeks that followed, this illusion of resistance would transform the streets of Berlin into killing grounds. One of the most desperate measures taken under the Fortress Decree was the mass mobilization of the Volkssturm, a national militia composed of men too old, too young, or otherwise unfit for regular army service. Announced in October 1944, but only fully activated in 1945, the Volkssturm represented the final scraping of Germany's manpower barrel. Men as old as 60 and boys barely 16 were handed obsolete rifles, a few rounds of ammunition, and orders to defend the city at all costs. The organization was chaotic, with little training, no uniforms beyond armbands, and almost no heavy weapons. Many Volkssturm units were led by Nazi Party officials rather than experienced soldiers, further reducing their effectiveness. Despite this, propaganda hailed them as the embodiment of German determination, a people's army rising to defend its sacred soil. Photographs of elderly men in worn coats clutching rifles were circulated in newspapers to inspire morale. For many of those conscripted, however, the experience was one of terror and helplessness, facing the Soviet war machine with no realistic chance of survival. The Volkssturm became both a tragic symbol of the regime's desperation and a cruel sacrifice of human lives for a hopeless cause. Perhaps even more chilling than the mobilization of the Volkssturm was the enlistment of the Hitler Youth into frontline combat. These boys, many between the ages of 12 and 17, had been indoctrinated for years in the ideology of the regime, taught to revere Hitler as a messianic figure. When Berlin was declared a fortress, they were summoned not as helpers but as soldiers, armed with Panzerfausts, simple anti-tank weapons. They were told to ambush Soviet armor in the ruins of their own city. Some were eager, driven by fanaticism and the promise of glory, while others were terrified, swept along by peer pressure and the iron grip of Nazi authority. Accounts from survivors tell of Hitler Youth battalions engaging Soviet tanks, sometimes succeeding in knocking out one or two vehicles before being annihilated in return. Propaganda exalted their sacrifices, portraying them as miniature heroes fighting like men. Yet the reality was unbearable. Children were thrown against battle-hardened troops in an utterly unequal fight. The mobilization of the Hitler Youth revealed the depths of Hitler's delusion, sacrificing the nation's children for a war that was already lost. The illusion of resistance, fostered by the Fortress Declaration, was reinforced by constant propaganda, which promised Berliners that wonder weapons and heroic sacrifices would turn the tide. Radio broadcasts blared slogans of defiance, insisting that salvation was near and that betrayal or surrender were unthinkable. Posters covered the walls of the city, depicting armed civilians standing tall against overwhelming odds. Speeches emphasized that every street, every house must be defended to the last cartridge. Hitler's words themselves, often read aloud in public squares, insisted that Berlin would remain unconquered, inspiring both fear and misplaced hope. The psychological impact was profound. While some clung to these illusions, others realized with despair that they were being dragged into a catastrophe. The regime relied on terror to enforce obedience, with threats of execution for desertion or defeatism. Yet even as shells began to fall on the outskirts of the city, officials continued to insist that Berlin could and would hold. This manufactured sense of determination was designed not only to stiffen resistance, but to bind the population in collective doom. Behind the rhetoric, however, the reality of Berlin's defenses told another story. The city lacked adequate fortifications, with only a few flak towers and hastily built barricades serving as defensive positions. Ammunition supplies were dwindling, food was scarce, and fuel for tanks and vehicles was nearly non-existent. Many units defending Berlin were either shattered remnants of once proud divisions or hastily assembled groups of Volkssturm and Hitler Youth. Experienced officers knew the situation was hopeless, but they were powerless to contradict Hitler's fantasy. The Red Army, numbering millions and equipped with thousands of tanks, artillery pieces and aircraft, was bearing down with unstoppable force. Still, Hitler insisted on dividing the city into defensive sectors, each to be held by different commanders. Orders were given for counterattacks that were impossible to carry out, as if maps and words could reverse the tide of history. The fortress, in truth, was already crumbling before the first shells even struck its heart. As Berlin prepared for its supposed stand, the civilian population bore the brunt of the hardship. Families dug crude shelters in basements, stocked with what little food and water they could find. Women and children were told to support the defense, from carrying ammunition to caring for the wounded. Some civilians resisted being drafted into the Volkssturm, but refusal often meant arrest or execution by Nazi authorities. Fear hung over the city like a pall, as rumors spread of what awaited them should the Soviets break through. Many dreaded retribution for the crimes of the Reich, especially after hearing of atrocities committed in East Prussia and Silesia. Others simply longed for the war to end, no matter the cost. Yet surrender was not an option the regime allowed, and so Berliners were trapped in a nightmare, caught between Hitler's delusions and the Soviet advance. Daily life became a grim routine of waiting, hiding, and preparing for inevitable destruction. The declaration of Fortress Berlin had condemned millions of ordinary people to suffer in the final act of the Reich's tragedy. The mobilization of Berlin also revealed the widening gulf between the regime's leadership and the reality on the ground. Hitler, isolated in his bunker, issued orders that bore little connection to the city's condition. Party officials enforced these commands with brutality, demanding that every street be defended, no matter the cost. Wehrmacht officers, many of them veterans of years of war, looked on in disbelief as schoolboys were sent to face Soviet tanks. Some tried to shield their men from suicidal missions, while others bowed to the pressure of fanaticism. Reports flowed back to the Führer insisting that resistance was fierce and morale unbroken, even as entire units collapsed. The insistence on mobilizing everyone, from the elderly to the very young, showed the regime's willingness to sacrifice its own people rather than admit defeat. This widening chasm between fantasy and reality became one of the defining features of the fortress city. In the end, Berlin was not a fortress at all. It was a slaughterhouse in the making. The declaration of Fortress Berlin and the mobilization of its defenders marked one of the darkest moments of the war. Rather than seeking surrender to spare the population, Hitler chose destruction, dragging civilians into his final gamble. The Volkssturm and Hitler Youth were not true armies but desperate human shields, pitted against overwhelming Soviet power. The illusion of resistance, maintained through propaganda and fear, could not conceal the inevitability of defeat. Yet this illusion mattered deeply to Hitler, for it allowed him to sustain his fantasy of ultimate victory even as reality crumbled. For the people of Berlin, however, it meant devastation, death, and despair. The stage was set for the climactic battle, where streets would run red with blood, and entire districts would be reduced to rubble. Fortress Berlin was never meant to endure. It was a symbolic gesture of a dictator unwilling to face truth. In its declaration, the final tragedy of Nazi Germany was sealed. The city itself was sacrificed to prolong the delusions of one man. By early April 1945, the Red Army stood poised on the banks of the Oder River, staring into the heart of Germany with Berlin as its final prize. Two of Stalin's most famous marshals, Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, were given overlapping directives, ensuring that competition between them would drive relentless advances. Stalin, ever the manipulator, deliberately created this rivalry, promising glory to whichever commander entered the German capital first. Zhukov, commanding the First Belarusian Front, was expected to smash through the Seelow heights directly east of Berlin. Meanwhile, Konev, leading the First Ukrainian Front, was to sweep in from the south, bypassing the strongest defenses and threatening the city from another axis. Their orders were simple in wording but titanic in scope: destroy the last organized German defenses, encircle Berlin, and force its surrender. Behind this rivalry lay the political reality that the Soviets wanted the capture of Berlin for themselves, before the Western Allies could reach it. Stalin knew the psychological value of seizing Hitler's capital, and so he pressured his commanders to achieve results at staggering speed, regardless of cost. Thus the stage was set for one of the most massive military assaults in history, driven by ambition, rivalry, and the hunger for total victory. The scale of forces marshaled for the Berlin operation was unprecedented, even by the already brutal standards of the Eastern Front. Zhukov commanded over 2.5 million men, supported by nearly 6,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces, and thousands of aircraft under the 16th Air Army. Konev wielded another 2 million troops, along with 6,000 tanks and assault guns, and immense artillery resources. The logistics of assembling such vast forces were staggering. Entire rail networks were dedicated to funneling supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements to the Oder River line. Soviet planners calculated that Berlin would require not only brute force, but also a ceaseless flow of shells, fuel, and replacement equipment. Engineers built pontoon bridges across rivers under enemy fire to ensure armored columns could move forward without pause. Supply depots were stocked to sustain continuous artillery barrages lasting days on end. The sheer weight of material was designed to overwhelm Germany's exhausted Wehrmacht, which by April could muster only 700,000 men, many of them poorly trained, poorly equipped, and lacking heavy armor. The Soviets sought not parity but crushing superiority, ensuring that when the attack came, it would fall with the weight of an avalanche. Zhukov's strategy for breaking through the Seelow heights was to unleash a colossal artillery bombardment of unprecedented intensity. The Soviet plan called for over 9,000 guns to fire simultaneously, blanketing German positions with shells before infantry and tanks advanced. The idea was to annihilate defenses before Soviet soldiers even set foot on the battlefield, reducing trenches, bunkers, and minefields into rubble. Soviet gunners prepared fire schedules down to the minute, coordinating barrages with advancing units, so that a rolling curtain of shells moved forward at set intervals. Rocket artillery, including the fearsome Katyusha launchers, was positioned in mass batteries to saturate German lines with waves of explosives. This was to be combined with the largest single air assault of the war on the Eastern Front, with hundreds of bombers and ground attack planes targeting German positions. Zhukov wanted nothing less than shock and awe, obliteration before the enemy could even react. Yet the Germans had prepared cleverly, reinforcing their defenses with deep trenches, camouflaged artillery, and flooded valleys to slow Soviet armor. The Seelow heights would prove a far tougher nut to crack than Zhukov anticipated, but on the eve of the battle, Soviet confidence seemed absolute. Meanwhile, Konev's forces prepared their own offensive thrust from the south, aiming to bypass the strongest fortifications and roll swiftly toward Berlin's southern districts. His plan emphasized mobility and encirclement, relying on his powerful tank armies, including the 3rd Guards Tank Army and 4th Guards Tank Army, to punch deep into German lines. Konev believed his armored spearheads, once unleashed, could slice through crumbling defenses with minimal delay. Like Zhukov, he assembled massive artillery concentrations, but his focus was on using tanks to exploit breakthroughs rather than bludgeoning the enemy into submission with prolonged bombardments. His forces also included elite Guards rifle divisions, hardened by years of combat, who were prepared for urban warfare once they reached Berlin's suburbs. Konev knew Stalin had given him an open-ended directive: if he could outpace Zhukov and enter Berlin first, glory would be his. This rivalry pushed him to prepare his forces with meticulous care, ensuring they were ready for rapid exploitation once German lines began to falter. In effect, Stalin's manipulation turned two of his greatest generals into competitors, each striving to seize the ultimate prize. Soviet preparations extended far beyond manpower and equipment. They also involved psychological warfare and deception. Propaganda units distributed leaflets urging German troops to surrender, emphasizing that resistance was futile and that their leaders had already condemned them to death. Loudspeakers were set up along the front lines, blaring warnings in German that the Red Army's vengeance was at hand. Soviet spies and reconnaissance patrols probed deep into German lines, identifying weaknesses and mapping out defensive belts. Maskirovka, the Soviet doctrine of deception, was employed extensively, with false troop movements and dummy tanks designed to mislead German intelligence about the exact points of attack. Nighttime preparations were cloaked under the thunder of artillery barrages, meant to disguise construction of bridges and forward supply dumps. The Soviets wanted German defenders to be overwhelmed, not only physically, but psychologically, crushed under the realization that they faced annihilation on an unimaginable scale. For many German soldiers manning the Seelow heights or defending the southern approaches, these measures sowed despair even before the first Soviet tank moved forward. Coordination between fronts was a crucial part of the plan, though it carried within it the seeds of friction. Zhukov and Konev were not merely rivals in ambition, but also differed in military philosophy. Zhukov was methodical, preferring overwhelming force and massive frontal assaults, even at high cost. Konev, on the other hand, valued maneuver and encirclement, exploiting German weaknesses rather than directly attacking their strongest points. Stalin encouraged their competition, but demanded cooperation when necessary, reminding them that the ultimate goal was the destruction of Berlin. To prevent confusion, boundary lines between the two fronts were drawn, but these were deliberately flexible, allowing either commander to push beyond them if circumstances favored rapid advance. This created tension, as both generals knew they could potentially steal each other's glory. Soviet high command therefore had to balance rivalry with unity, ensuring that both forces advanced in concert without descending into chaos. The result was a unique mixture of cooperation and competition, an uneasy alliance shaped by Stalin's political maneuvering. The Red Army's air support for the Berlin operation was also prepared on an immense scale. The 16th Air Army, supporting Zhukov, and the 2nd Air Army, supporting Konev, were tasked with achieving total air supremacy over the battlefield. Soviet pilots had by now gained tremendous experience in both air-to-air combat and close support missions, and their numbers dwarfed the remnants of the Luftwaffe. Bombers were scheduled to strike German positions in coordination with artillery barrages, turning defensive lines into infernos of fire and smoke. Ground attack planes like the Il-2 Sturmovik were massed to strafe and bomb German armor, artillery, and troop concentrations. Air reconnaissance mapped every road, railway, and strongpoint leading to Berlin, ensuring that no German movement went unnoticed. The Soviets also used gliders and transport planes to move supplies and medical units forward rapidly, reducing delays caused by destroyed roads and railways. In effect, Soviet preparations created a combined arms juggernaut where infantry, armor, artillery, and air power would work in seamless coordination to grind down the enemy. It was the culmination of years of evolution in Soviet warfare since the disasters of 1941. On the eve of the Berlin operation, the Red Army's confidence was tempered by the recognition of what lay ahead. The Germans, though weakened, had shown time and again their capacity for desperate resistance. Hitler had declared Berlin a fortress, and fanatical units of the Waffen-SS, Volkssturm, and Hitler Youth were being mobilized for last stands. Yet the Soviets believed their preparations had left nothing to chance. Vast reserves of ammunition, fuel, and food were stockpiled to sustain operations even if progress slowed. Medical services were ready to handle hundreds of thousands of casualties, with field hospitals set up close to the front. Political officers ensured that morale remained high, reminding soldiers that they were about to deliver the final blow to fascism. Soldiers painted slogans on their tanks: "To Berlin, for Stalin, for the motherland." The atmosphere crackled with tension, anticipation, and grim determination. Every soldier knew that the coming battle would be the climax of years of struggle, a final storm that would decide the fate of Nazi Germany. In mid-April 1945, as the Red Army stood poised to strike the final blow, all eyes turned to the Oder River line, the last natural barrier before Berlin. The Seelow Heights, rising modestly above the surrounding plains, became a fortress of desperation for the German defenders. General Gotthard Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula, carefully orchestrated defenses, recognizing that this was the only place where the Soviet steamroller might be slowed. He ordered the flooding of lowlands by opening dikes and turning fields into swamps to trap tanks and infantry. He dug lines of trenches, created concealed machine gun nests, and laid countless mines. Behind the main positions, retreating Germans set demolition charges on bridges to stall Soviet advances. Every village was fortified into a miniature fortress, with anti-tank weapons waiting in ambush. Heinrici, though loyal, knew the cause was lost, yet he was determined to bleed the Soviets. For the Wehrmacht, Seelow was not simply a battlefield, it was the gate to the Reich's capital. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, tasked with smashing through Seelow, assembled one of the most concentrated arrays of firepower in military history. On April 16th, at exactly 3 a.m., the night sky erupted as over 40,000 Soviet artillery pieces, mortars and rocket launchers unleashed a storm of steel. The bombardment lasted nearly an hour, its deafening roar shaking the ground for miles. Artillery shells illuminated the horizon, and Katyusha rockets screamed overhead like fiery comets. Entire German defensive positions were pulverized, villages reduced to burning skeletons, and forests stripped of leaves in seconds. The Soviets fired more shells in one morning than some armies had fired in entire campaigns. Civilians hiding in basements cowered as walls shook and glass shattered, but Heinrici had anticipated this onslaught and cunningly pulled his forward units back just before the barrage. When Soviet infantry advanced, they found empty craters and wreckage instead of destroyed troops. The opening gambit of Zhukov's assault, meant to annihilate the enemy, had blasted mostly empty ground. As the Soviet infantry pushed forward, they quickly discovered that Heinrici's defenses were not just physical but psychological. German positions, hidden within fog and smoke, suddenly erupted with gunfire once the barrage lifted. Soviet troops stumbled into swamps and flooded fields, their boots sinking in mud, while German machine guns cut them down. Tanks rolled forward, but found themselves stuck in marshes where anti-tank crews destroyed them with panzerfausts. The steep slopes of the Seelow Heights, though only modest in elevation, became walls of death for those climbing under fire. The Soviets, expecting a rapid breakthrough, were stunned at the ferocity of resistance. Despite overwhelming numbers, progress slowed to a crawl. Zhukov's commanders urged him to reconsider, but he pressed on, determined to break through before Marshal Konev's competing forces could claim Berlin. Soviet soldiers, exhausted but ordered to advance at all costs, pressed themselves against burning wreckage for cover as they pushed step by bloody step. The battlefield was a vision of hell, as the Red Army's massed formations collided with layers of German defenses. Engineers worked frantically to build pontoon bridges across the Oder, while under constant bombardment. Soviet air units, flying hundreds of sorties, strafed German lines with machine gun fire and dropped bombs in waves. Yet the Germans fought with a grim determination born of desperation, using every hedgerow and ruined farmstead as a defensive bunker. The Volkssturm, old men and teenage boys armed with rifles and panzerfausts, added to the chaos, fighting alongside battle-hardened Wehrmacht veterans. At Seelow, even civilian volunteers found themselves pressed into service, ferrying ammunition to the front. The Germans were vastly outnumbered, barely 90,000 troops against over 1 million Soviets, but they made every shell and bullet count. Soviet casualties mounted alarmingly, and stretcher-bearers struggled to keep up with the flood of wounded. The clash at Seelow became a grinding, merciless struggle of attrition. By midday on April 16th, Zhukov realized that the expected breakthrough was failing to materialize. Soviet tanks clogged the roads, churning mud into impassable bogs. Commanders shouted orders above the din, as stalled columns became easy targets for German artillery. Soviet morale began to waver as men fell in droves, and whispers spread that Konev's forces to the south might reach Berlin first. Stalin, impatient and watching events closely, pressured Zhukov to accelerate the assault. Determined not to be humiliated, Zhukov unleashed his reserves, entire tank armies and fresh infantry divisions thrown into the grinder. The result was an even bloodier collision, as masses of troops surged forward into German crossfire. For hours, Soviet soldiers advanced only to be thrown back, their corpses carpeting the fields. The Seelow heights became synonymous with carnage, as artillery thundered day and night, the sound audible deep inside Berlin. As night fell, fires lit the horizon like an infernal glow, turning the battlefield into a surreal nightmare. Soviet soldiers stumbled in exhaustion, their faces blackened with soot, their hands blistered from hauling weapons and ammunition. German troops, though few in number, clung stubbornly to every trench and foxhole, launching counterattacks under cover of darkness. The Soviets, using searchlights to blind defenders and guide their troops, cast ghostly beams across the fields. Yet these lights also revealed their positions, turning them into targets for German gunners. The night echoed with screams, the clatter of machine guns and the thunder of shells. Amid this chaos, commanders on both sides lost contact with units, and battles devolved into savage close-quarter combat with knives, grenades, and rifle butts. The once quiet Oder plain had transformed into a cauldron of destruction, a place where no man could stand without risking death. The first day of fighting ended without the decisive breakthrough Zhukov had promised. On April 17th, the Soviets renewed their assault with even greater ferocity, determined to shatter German resistance once and for all. Artillery thundered again, though ammunition shortages forced more precise targeting. Infantry stormed trenches, throwing grenades before charging with bayonets fixed. German defenders, many fighting to protect families still trapped in Berlin, resisted to the last bullet. Panzer divisions, though diminished, counterattacked wherever possible, briefly pushing Soviet troops back down the slopes. Yet the weight of Soviet numbers was crushing, and slowly the Germans were driven from one defensive line to another. The battlefield stank of cordite, blood and burning flesh, while horses and tanks alike lay destroyed in grotesque heaps. The Soviets adapted, bringing flamethrowers and self-propelled guns to clear bunkers. By the third day, even Henritti admitted the defense could not hold much longer. The German army was bleeding itself to death for a hopeless cause. Finally, on April 19th, after 3 days of relentless carnage, the German lines at Seelow began to crumble. Exhausted defenders fell back in disarray, their ammunition spent, their positions overrun by Soviet tanks. The road to Berlin now lay open, but at a horrific cost. The Red Army had lost tens of thousands of men, more than in many earlier campaigns, while the Germans sacrificed their last reserves in a futile defense. Zhukov's forces poured through the gap, streams of tanks and infantry surging westward. Yet the memory of Seelow lingered as a grim testament to the price of conquest. Survivors on both sides would never forget the slaughter, the mud, the fire, and the endless shelling that turned the Oder front into one of the most brutal battles of the war. Berlin was now within reach, but the blood toll at Seelow foreshadowed the savagery that awaited in the streets of the German capital. As the battle for Seelow Heights ground to its bloody conclusion, the Soviet High Command swiftly shifted its gaze toward the next objective, the total encirclement of Berlin. Joseph Stalin, ever conscious of both military prestige and political influence, urged his marshals to press forward relentlessly. Marshal Zhukov's forces, having broken through the German defensive lines on the Oder, surged westward like an unstoppable tide. Meanwhile, Marshal Konev's armies were racing north from the southern front, eager to secure their share of the final prize. The grand strategy was simple but ruthless. Berlin would be surrounded from all sides, cut off from any potential reinforcements or supplies. To the German soldiers still clinging to positions east of the capital, the speed of the Soviet advance was shocking. Columns of tanks churned through villages, artillery thundered day and night, and skies swarmed with Soviet aircraft hunting retreating columns. Every road, every river crossing, and every patch of ground seemed contested, as Soviet infantry swarmed across the plains in overwhelming numbers. The German defense was fragmented, its command structure disorganized, its resources drained. The stage was set for Berlin to become a city encircled, a doomed fortress awaiting its inevitable siege. On April 21st, 1945, the thunder of Soviet artillery could already be heard from the heart of Berlin itself. It was a grim prelude of what was to come, a sign that the capital was now within striking range of the Red Army. Soviet armored spearheads, spearheaded by T-34 SES and heavy IS-2 tanks, were pressing westward with astonishing speed. Resistance was often limited to small groups of German units desperately trying to hold crossroads or delay advances with makeshift barricades. But every hour brought new losses for the Germans, as Soviet tanks rolled past, destroyed villages and burning fields. Civilians who had not fled found themselves trapped in the chaos, often caught between retreating Wehrmacht forces and advancing Red Army troops. The once orderly roads of Brandenburg became choked with wrecked vehicles, abandoned carts and columns of refugees. Soviet commanders wasted no time in exploiting these weaknesses, sending armored columns deep behind German lines to sever key roads and railways. By the third week of April, the German capital was increasingly isolated, with only a few tenuous connections to the west and south. Berlin was already beginning to suffocate under the tightening Soviet noose. The Germans attempted to stabilize their collapsing front lines with hastily organized counterattacks, but the Soviet tide was too vast and too determined. Small Kampfgruppen, composed of remnants of Wehrmacht divisions, SS units, and hastily armed Volkssturm, tried to mount ambushes along forest roads. Occasionally, they succeeded in delaying a Soviet advance for a few hours, knocking out a tank or two with Panzerfausts before being overrun. However, the overall picture remained catastrophic for the German defenders. Soviet artillery blanketed suspected strongpoints before any major push, ensuring that German counterattacks were short-lived. With Soviet aircraft dominating the skies, any German reinforcements attempting to move toward Berlin risked being annihilated on open roads. Bridges were destroyed, railway lines severed, and fuel reserves dwindled to nothing. The once proud German army had been reduced to fragments of its former power, forced into constant retreat and desperate improvisation. Encirclement was not just a possibility, it was rapidly becoming a certainty. The Soviet pincers were closing with merciless precision, guided by overwhelming superiority in manpower, armor, and firepower. On the southern front, Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front surged northward, crossing the River Spree and threatening to cut off Berlin from the west. His armies moved with breathtaking momentum, bypassing pockets of German resistance and focusing on reaching the encirclement line. Soviet tank armies poured across the open plains, maneuvering with skill learned from years of brutal warfare. German defenders, often isolated battalions with little heavy weaponry, were crushed under the weight of armored columns. Villages that dared resist were shelled into rubble, leaving smoldering ruins as markers of the Soviet advance. The Germans tried to use the remnants of their armored units, including the fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks, but their numbers were pitiful compared to the Soviet masses. Many of these vehicles were abandoned for lack of fuel or mechanical breakdowns, leaving them as hulks by the roadside. Konev's troops advanced relentlessly, determined to link up with Zhukov's forces north of Berlin. Stalin's directive was clear: there would be no escape route left open for the German capital. Each kilometer gained brought Berlin one step closer to complete isolation. Meanwhile, Zhukov's First Belarusian Front pressed in from the east, pushing German defenders toward the Spree and cutting through their rear positions. Soviet commanders coordinated devastating artillery strikes to crush any concentrations of enemy resistance. Infantry divisions moved behind armored columns, clearing out forests, bunkers, and villages one by one. German attempts to fortify positions were swept aside by overwhelming firepower. Every day, Berlin's lines of communication grew thinner. The lifelines to the outside world snapped one after another. Civilians attempting to flee westward found themselves trapped as Soviet patrols seized control of highways and bridges. The Luftwaffe was virtually non-existent, leaving the German capital entirely vulnerable from the air. Soviet reconnaissance planes and bombers harassed retreating columns, adding to the sense of chaos. German command posts reported increasingly frantic messages from isolated units being surrounded or destroyed. By April 24th, Berlin was effectively cut off from the east and south, its isolation almost complete. Knowles his. The encirclement reached its decisive stage when Soviet forces from the north and south finally linked up, sealing the fate of Berlin. On April 25, 1945, Soviet spearheads met west of the city at Ketsin and near Potsdam, cutting the last major road connections. This historic moment marked the final encirclement of the German capital, ensuring that no significant reinforcements or supplies could enter the city. Inside Berlin, the German command was thrown into disarray, realizing they were trapped in a massive pocket. The reality of encirclement weighed heavily on both soldiers and civilians, as the prospect of relief from the west now became an illusion. The Soviets had not only cut off Berlin, but also severed its ties with any semblance of organized defense. German troops outside the pocket were either retreating in chaos toward Bavaria or being crushed by advancing Allied forces. Inside the city, commanders began preparing for a siege that they knew they could not win. For the Soviets, this was the moment of triumph, the culmination of years of brutal struggle against the Reich. For the Germans, it was the beginning of the end. With Berlin encircled, the psychological strain on its inhabitants deepened dramatically. Civilians realized they were trapped, with no way to escape the coming storm. Food supplies dwindled, water systems faltered, and medical resources were stretched to breaking point. Panic gripped neighborhoods as rumors spread of Soviet atrocities committed in nearby villages. At the same time, Nazi propaganda continued to insist that salvation was coming, that a counter-offensive from the West would arrive. Leaflets and radio broadcasts spoke of General Wendt's 12th Army advancing to relieve Berlin, though most insiders knew this was a fantasy. Still, many clung desperately to these false hopes, for the alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. The city prepared for the siege in whatever way it could. Barricades were erected, Volkssturm mobilized, and anti-tank ditches dug across major streets. Yet beneath the defiance lay an overwhelming sense of dread. The noose was drawn tight, and the storm was about to break. For the Red Army, the encirclement was both a military achievement and a symbolic triumph. Berlin, the heart of the Nazi Empire, was now theirs to crush, and they intended to do so with overwhelming force. Stalin demanded a rapid conquest, not only to end the war, but also to stake his claim in the post-war order. Soviet soldiers understood the historic nature of their mission, and many were driven by years of suffering inflicted by the German invasion of their homeland. The encirclement had cut Berlin off like a tumor, leaving it to be destroyed at the Soviets' discretion. Supply lines were firmly established, reinforcements poured in, and artillery was positioned for the final assault. Inside the city, the Germans braced for annihilation, while outside, Soviet troops prepared for a battle that would test their endurance once more. The stage was set for one of the most brutal urban battles in modern history. Encirclement was not the end, it was merely the beginning of the nightmare that awaited inside the German capital. As the Soviet pincers closed around Berlin, the larger structure of the German defense began to unravel, most notably Army Group Vistula, commanded by General Gotthard Heinrici. Originally tasked with holding the Oder line and protecting the approach to Berlin, the army group had been repeatedly battered by Zhukov's relentless offensives. Its divisions, a mixture of regular Wehrmacht units, ad hoc Volkssturm battalions, and remnants of shattered formations from previous campaigns, were exhausted and depleted. Soldiers were running low on ammunition, fuel, and morale, their cohesion eroding with every Soviet breakthrough. Communication lines were in chaos, with radio contact often lost and messengers either killed or delayed by advancing Soviet forces. Isolated pockets of resistance attempted to slow the Soviet juggernaut, but these efforts were sporadic and increasingly desperate. Heinrici himself understood the hopelessness of the situation, yet orders from Hitler demanded that Berlin remain unconquerable. The army group's structure was further compromised by internal conflicts between senior officers and political commissars enforcing Nazi ideology. Desertions were rising as soldiers abandoned positions under the pressure of encirclement and bombardment. Within days, the once formidable army group Vistula was effectively disintegrating under the weight of overwhelming Soviet power. The northern formations of the army group, including the remnants of the 3rd Panzer and 4th SS Panzer divisions, had been decimated during the Seelow Heights battle. These units had lost much of their armor and artillery in futile attempts to hold the Oder crossings. Soldiers were forced into makeshift defensive lines, often with no continuous trenches, relying instead on rubble, hedgerows, and collapsed buildings for cover. Supply convoys were repeatedly ambushed, leaving troops with meager rations and ineffective weapons. German engineers struggled to repair destroyed bridges and clear roads, but Soviet forces moved faster than any repairs could be completed. Desertion and surrender became increasingly common, as even the most ideologically committed troops realized the futility of resistance. In some cases, units disbanded entirely, with small groups attempting to flee westward to surrender to the Americans, rather than face the Red Army. The northern sectors were particularly chaotic, as civilians fleeing the advancing Soviets clogged streets and railway lines. Units tried to regroup at makeshift command posts, only to be overrun again. The fragmentation of the northern formations marked the beginning of a full collapse across the army group. Navarkhan. Meanwhile, the southern formations of Army Group Vistula fared no better, with battered remnants of the 9th Army and hastily assembled militia thrown into the line. General Theodor Buzz, commanding what remained of the 9th Army, struggled to maintain any semblance of order amidst widespread panic. Soldiers lacked cohesion, as units were mixed together without regard for original structure, combining seasoned troops with inexperienced Volkssturm and Hitler Youth. Soviet artillery relentlessly pounded defensive positions, shattering morale and inflicting massive casualties. Counterattacks, when attempted, were piecemeal and easily repelled by superior Soviet firepower and tactical coordination. Fuel shortages grounded armored vehicles, leaving infantry exposed to machine gun and artillery fire. Retreats turned into chaotic routes, with soldiers abandoning heavy weapons and vehicles in desperation. Communication with higher command was virtually non-existent, leaving local commanders to make decisions with incomplete intelligence. Civilians trapped in these southern sectors were caught in crossfire, often mingling with retreating troops and adding to the disorder. By mid-April, southern formations were effectively a series of isolated collapsing pockets, incapable of mounting organized resistance. The Volkssturm, composed largely of older men and young boys, bore the brunt of the German defensive collapse. Hastily armed and poorly trained, they were sent to front-line positions in Berlin's outskirts and along the approaches from the Oder. Their morale varied wildly. Some fought with desperate courage, others froze or fled under Soviet assault. Lacking artillery, anti-tank weapons, and coherent leadership, these units were almost entirely at the mercy of advancing Soviet forces. In many towns, Volkssturm units were quickly surrounded and annihilated, leaving bodies in streets and fields as grim markers of their sacrifice. The integration of these militias into regular army formations caused friction and further reduced effectiveness. Senior Wehrmacht officers often blamed Hitler's political appointees for the disarray, accusing them of forcing civilians into combat without strategy. Desertions among regular troops rose in parallel with the disintegration of Volkssturm units, creating a cascade effect of weakening defenses. By the time Soviet spearheads reached the suburbs of Berlin, the Volkssturm had largely ceased to exist as a functional fighting force. Their collapse symbolized the broader implosion of German defenses on all fronts. The key Vorfintus and Pincers. Logistical collapse compounded the deterioration of Army Group Vistula. Fuel depots had been destroyed in Soviet air raids, preventing the movement of armored reserves. Ammunition shortages meant that even entrenched positions could not be held for long. Food and medical supplies were vanishing, and morale suffered accordingly. Soldiers scavenged for whatever provisions they could find, often turning to civilian houses for sustenance. Railway lines were torn apart or captured, severing critical supply routes to the front. Commanders attempted to coordinate counterattacks, but the lack of transport and communications rendered plans largely symbolic. Soviet reconnaissance constantly harassed movements, ensuring that any German attempts to regroup were detected and destroyed. Panic and rumor spread quickly through the ranks, creating an environment of mistrust and despair. In such conditions, organized resistance became nearly impossible, and Army Group Vistula's operational effectiveness deteriorated daily. The collapse of the Army Group had immediate consequences for Berlin's defenders. As Army Group Vistula disintegrated, Soviet forces were able to move unimpeded into the flanks and rear of Berlin. German units still inside the city received fewer reinforcements and resupplies, effectively sealing them off. Many frontline commanders in Berlin began to realize that they were trapped in an encirclement with little hope of relief. Hitler, refusing to acknowledge the reality, continued to issue orders that were strategically meaningless, demanding offensive operations from units that were barely functional. Communication between the city and Army Group Vistula was sporadic at best, with messages often delayed, misinterpreted, or intercepted. The fragmentation of the Army Group also allowed Soviet commanders to exploit gaps, creating corridors for armored thrusts and encroachment on Berlin's suburbs. Panic spread among troops, many of whom had witnessed the total collapse of neighboring units. With morale broken and cohesion lost, the German defenders were slowly being strangled before the siege of Berlin even fully began. The city's fate was increasingly sealed by the wider collapse around it. Attempts to reorganize scattered units proved futile as the pace of the Soviet advance accelerated. Desperate commanders tried to consolidate remnants of divisions into ad hoc combat groups, but these often consisted of a few hundred soldiers at most. Many units lacked officers, with junior leaders stepping into roles for which they were unprepared. Coordination across different formations became impossible under the constant bombardment and pressure. Isolated German soldiers frequently surrendered en masse to Soviet patrols rather than continue fighting in a hopeless situation. Roadblocks and barricades intended to delay the enemy were quickly bypassed or destroyed. The Soviet practice of encircling and annihilating pockets of resistance ensured that regrouping efforts rarely succeeded. Stragglers attempted to flee west, hoping to surrender to the Western Allies instead of facing the Red Army. The breakdown of Army Group Vistula effectively left Berlin's eastern approaches undefended. The city was now facing not only a siege, but the reality that organized external support was no longer available. By the last week of April 1945, Army Group Vistula had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The remnants were either captured, destroyed, or scattered in small groups attempting to escape the encirclement. Soviet forces, having destroyed any semblance of organized resistance, were now able to concentrate entirely on the final battle for Berlin. The collapse of the army group demonstrated the cumulative effect of years of attrition, relentless Soviet offensives, and the disastrous strategic decisions of Hitler and the Nazi high command. Soldiers inside Berlin realized that they were now on their own, facing an overwhelming enemy with no hope of relief. Command structures inside the city became desperate improvisations, trying to plug gaps left by the total breakdown of the external defensive lines. Civilians, witnessing the retreat and collapse, were gripped by terror as the Red Army loomed ever closer. The fall of Army Group Vistula marked the final stage in Germany's military disintegration. With Berlin isolated and surrounded, the last chapter of the Third Reich's military might had begun. The stage was set for the city's destruction and the final act of the European theatre. Thou. By late April 1945, Berlin was transformed from a bustling metropolis into a city of fear and ruin, where civilians lived under constant threat from artillery shells and aerial bombardments. The air was thick with smoke from burning buildings, and streets were littered with rubble, shattered glass, and abandoned belongings. Families huddled in basements and makeshift shelters, praying that the next Soviet shell would not penetrate their fragile cover. Propaganda posters still adorned partially destroyed walls, depicting Hitler as a protector of the Reich, yet these images rang hollow amidst the chaos. Rumors spread rapidly. Soviet atrocities, mass executions, and retaliatory violence terrified the population. Food was scarce, with queues stretching for blocks at government distribution points, only to leave many returning home empty-handed. Water supply systems had been disrupted, forcing desperate residents to collect from contaminated sources. The stench of death and decay permeated neighborhoods, as both civilian casualties and abandoned corpses accumulated. Despite this, some Berliners attempted to maintain semblances of normalcy, children playing amidst ruins, women preparing meager meals, and the elderly moving cautiously through debris. Survival required vigilance, adaptability, and a constant readiness to flee or hide at a moment's notice. The fear of the advancing Red Army dominated daily life, reinforced by chilling stories from refugees and defectors fleeing from the east. Many civilians were convinced that capture would mean certain death, while others feared sexual violence and plundering. Mothers clutched children tightly, covering their ears against the screams of falling shells and the thundering of tanks in the distance. Basements and subway tunnels became refuges, often overcrowded, damp and unsanitary, contributing to illness and despair. Propaganda radio broadcasts urged citizens to hold fast, painting the Soviets as barbaric and the Führer as a savior. Yet the reality outside these walls told a starkly different story. Some civilians attempted to flee westward, navigating streets strewn with barricades and the remnants of destroyed vehicles. Black markets emerged, selling everything from bread to fuel, often at exorbitant prices. Fear was compounded by uncertainty, as many did not know if their family members had survived previous attacks. The psychological strain was immense, producing anxiety, hysteria, and in some cases resignation. Life in Berlin had become a delicate balance between seeking shelter, finding sustenance, and avoiding both enemy fire and collapsing infrastructure. The Nazi regime's propaganda machinery attempted to maintain civilian morale even as the city crumbled around them. Loudspeakers mounted on trucks and buildings broadcasted messages urging courage and unwavering loyalty to Hitler. Newspapers, though scarcely printed, published exaggerated accounts of German victories and enemy failures, aiming to instill hope in a population teetering on the brink of panic. Children were indoctrinated alongside soldiers, reciting slogans and pledging allegiance to the Reich. In contrast, reality painted a stark picture: neighborhoods flattened by artillery, homes gutted by fire, and streets blocked with wreckage. The tension between propaganda and lived experience created cognitive dissonance, with many Berliners forced to reconcile official narratives with the devastation they witnessed. Teachers, clergy, and community leaders struggled to comfort the populace while themselves confronting their fear. Hospitals overflowed with wounded civilians, while makeshift morgues were filled with bodies awaiting identification. Food and water scarcity heightened social tensions, occasionally sparking conflicts over resources. The omnipresent sense of doom fostered both resilience and despair, shaping the civilian psyche in profound and lasting ways. Children, the most vulnerable in this urban nightmare, endured trauma beyond imagination. Many witnessed parents and neighbors killed or injured, their formative years marked by explosions and sirens rather than play and schooling. Some were recruited into the Hitler Youth, participating in auxiliary defense tasks, distributing propaganda, or even acting as couriers under dangerous conditions. Others hid in basements and bunkers, often isolated from family members, while struggling to comprehend the violence surrounding them. Hunger and illness were constant companions, weakening bodies already vulnerable to the stress of bombardment. The psychological toll manifested in nightmares, panic attacks, and erratic behavior. Adults, while trying to shield the children, were equally consumed by survival instincts, rationing food and searching for safe shelter. Elderly residents, unable to flee or fight, faced particular peril, frequently trapped under rubble or cut off from medical assistance. Fear pervaded every household, yet fleeting moments of human connection, shared meals, whispered prayers, or quiet songs offered brief relief. The daily experience for children in Berlin was a harrowing journey between life, death, and the unknown future. Urban infrastructure collapse further exacerbated civilian suffering, leaving residents trapped in a city increasingly unrecognizable. Bridges were destroyed, cutting off access to neighboring districts and preventing escape routes. Water mains were severed, leaving wells and contaminated rivers as the only sources for drinking and cooking. Electricity was sporadic, plunging buildings into darkness at night, intensifying the fear of Soviet troops approaching under cover. Fires from artillery strikes consumed entire streets, and smoke choked those unable to find shelter. Hospitals were overwhelmed, with shortages of bandages, medicine, and medical personnel. Collapsed buildings forced families into shared basements or improvised bunkers, increasing disease transmission and interpersonal tension. The streets themselves became dangerous, filled with unexploded ordnance, rubble, and remnants of burned-out vehicles. Each day was a negotiation with chaos, requiring constant vigilance and resourcefulness. Civilian survival depended on adapting to the relentless collapse of the city's physical and social infrastructure. Amidst the chaos, acts of compassion and courage emerged, revealing the resilience of the human spirit. Neighbors shared meager food rations and medical supplies despite the risk of Soviet raids. Community networks formed in basements and shelters, providing protection and morale support to the vulnerable. Some citizens took enormous risks to rescue children from dangerous areas or help the wounded. Kolji and volunteers organized clandestine relief efforts, distributing water and tending to the sick. Underground networks developed to smuggle supplies from less damaged districts or the countryside. Even in the face of imminent defeat, small acts of humanity provided psychological sustenance to civilians. These networks often operated at great personal risk, as both German military authorities and Soviet forces could punish perceived disloyalty. Stories of heroism circulated in whispers, providing glimmers of hope amid despair. The fabric of communal life, though strained and frayed, persisted in pockets throughout the city. This tenuous support system became essential for daily survival in bombed-out Berlin. Tings. The psychological impact of relentless bombing and siege warfare left an indelible mark on Berliners. Continuous shelling, low-flying aircraft, and artillery barrages created a persistent state of trauma and hypervigilance. Anxiety manifested in insomnia, tremors, and erratic behavior, while grief over lost family members compounded the stress. Civilians often had to make impossible decisions, such as abandoning a dying relative to find safer shelter or leaving behind possessions for survival. Trust eroded, as strangers might steal food or weapons, while neighbors competed for scarce resources. Despite the ever-present fear, daily routines were maintained as much as possible, with people queuing for bread, collecting water, or tending to the wounded. Children absorbed the violence into their understanding of the world, learning to navigate bombs and barricades instinctively. Psychological resilience became a crucial skill, often surpassing physical endurance in importance. Propaganda and rumor further influenced perceptions, with false reports either inflating hope or deepening despair. By the final days, the city's civilian population was psychologically battered, living in constant anticipation of the Red Army's final push. As Soviet forces drew ever closer to the heart of Berlin, civilian survival became a mixture of strategy, luck, and endurance. Basements, cellars, and subway tunnels were continuously used for shelter, often shared by dozens of families. Fire, collapse, and enemy patrols remained constant threats, forcing inhabitants to move carefully and silently. Hunger, disease, and injury compounded the omnipresent fear, leaving civilians physically and mentally exhausted. Rumors of atrocities committed against the defenseless amplified terror, often prompting mass flight attempts that were equally perilous. Those remaining relied on small acts of solidarity, community organization, and resourcefulness to endure. Women and children bore the heaviest burdens, scavenging for food and tending to the wounded, while men were drawn into last-ditch defense efforts. The final days of April 1945 saw a city teetering on the edge of collapse, its population trapped in a living nightmare. Civilians were no longer passive observers, but active participants in a struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. In the shadows of burning streets and shattered buildings, the human capacity for resilience, fear, and despair was laid bare, marking the civilian experience as one of the most harrowing dimensions of the Battle of Berlin. On the early morning of April 16, 1945, the first Soviet assault forces reached the outer defensive ring of Berlin, where exhausted German troops and hastily organized Volkssturm units awaited. Artillery barrages had already softened the city's periphery, reducing bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and defensive positions to rubble. Smoke hung over the fields and avenues like a pall, a grim announcement that the battle for the German capital had begun in earnest. Tanks of the First Belarusian Front rolled forward, supported by waves of infantry advancing under the cover of relentless bombardment. German defenders, many of them untrained teenagers or men in their 60s, attempted to slow the Soviet advance with machine guns, Panzerfausts, and improvised barricades. Explosions shattered windows, dislodged roof tiles, and sent debris raining down on terrified civilians caught in the open. Artillery and small arms fire created a chaotic soundscape, a symphony of destruction that would mark every street, square, and avenue in the coming days. Civilians emerged from basements to witness the terrifying spectacle, some praying silently, others attempting to flee before the front closed in. Smoke from burning vehicles mingled with the morning fog, creating an almost surreal, apocalyptic landscape. Each Soviet advance was met with pockets of desperate resistance, making every step forward costly and bloody. The initial Soviet breakthrough occurred along the city's eastern outskirts, where German barricades and anti-tank ditches offered only temporary impediments. Soviet engineers worked feverishly under fire to clear rubble, remove obstacles, and create paths for armored units. Mortar shells and artillery rounds pounded the streets, while infantry units engaged in close-quarters firefights, storming buildings one floor at a time. German defenders utilized cellars and upper floors for sniper positions, pouring deadly fire onto advancing Red Army soldiers. Civilians trapped in the crossfire scrambled for cover, often forced to move between shattered buildings in search of relative safety. Dogs barked and panicked animals dashed through debris-strewn streets, adding to the chaos. Explosions tore through facades, sending masonry crashing into alleys below, often burying those who had taken refuge. Communications between German units were fragmented, and disorganized counterattacks were quickly repelled. Every building became a mini-fortress, with room-to-room combat that blurred the lines between soldier and civilian space. The sheer intensity of this urban battlefield signaled that the fight for Berlin would be both prolonged and devastating. Soviet combined arms tactics were crucial in overcoming the city's initial defenses. Artillery bombardments preceded infantry movements, softening German positions and destroying visible fortifications. Tank units moved in tandem with infantry, covering flanks and engaging fortified positions with high explosive shells. Aircraft from the Red Air Force strafed streets and destroyed reinforced positions, adding aerial terror to the ground assault. Coordination between different Soviet armies, notably Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Konev's First Ukrainian Front, ensured simultaneous pressure on multiple sectors. Engineers planted explosives to bring down barricades and detonate booby-trapped buildings. Communication lines were maintained using runners and field radios, allowing dynamic responses to German countermeasures. German units, often fragmented and leaderless, could not mount sustained resistance beyond isolated pockets. The Soviets pressed forward, aware that slow progress could allow Hitler's forces to consolidate and extend the fight. Civilian infrastructure, water, electricity, transportation collapsed under bombardment, leaving survivors increasingly vulnerable. By evening, the first neighborhoods had been captured, their streets littered with the detritus of violent conquest. Über 1000 Nord. Urban combat in Berlin was characterized by block-by-block clearing operations that stretched Soviet soldiers to exhaustion. Each street intersection, each building corner, concealed hidden defenders, mines, or ambushes. Hand-to-hand combat was frequent, with bayonets, rifles, and improvised weapons employed in the confined spaces of shattered homes. Snipers perched on rooftops made every street a potential death trap, forcing Soviet troops to use smoke and covering fire. Civilians were often caught in crossfire, and those attempting to flee could easily stumble into German or Soviet killing zones. Basements became defensive strongpoints, holding small groups of determined defenders who could repel superior forces temporarily. Fires from shelling and incendiary rounds spread rapidly, consuming buildings and sending choking smoke through streets and tunnels. Commanders on both sides faced impossible choices: press the attack, risking heavy casualties, or delay, allowing enemy defenders to regroup. Soviet units frequently coordinated artillery strikes on their own positions to flush out entrenched Germans, illustrating the ruthless pragmatism of urban warfare. The psychological toll on both soldiers and civilians was immense, with fear, confusion, and adrenaline blending into a constant state of tension. German defenders improvised constantly, reinforcing barricades with furniture, vehicles, and sandbags, while snipers moved between vantage points in twisted buildings. Civilian participation was forced, with Hitler Youth tasked with supporting ammunition transport, medical assistance, and even frontline defense under adult supervision. Communication with higher command was sporadic, and morale fluctuated wildly between courage and despair. Volkssturm units often broke under concentrated Soviet fire, while elite SS or Wehrmacht contingents inflicted heavy casualties on advancing Red Army units. Every intersection became a battlefield, with artillery and machine gun nests targeting advancing soldiers and creating deadly choke points. Civilians hiding in cellars experienced continuous trauma, as walls shook from nearby explosions and distant cries of the wounded echoed in darkness. Fires raged in multiple districts simultaneously, intensifying panic and hampering Soviet advance due to smoke and visibility issues. Localized counterattacks by German troops, though desperate, were sometimes effective, temporarily retaking small areas before being overwhelmed. Supply lines for both sides were perilous, as every street presented danger from mines, sniper fire, and collapsing structures. By the end of the first day, the outer districts of Berlin had shifted hands, setting the stage for brutal inner-city combat. Soviet forces quickly adapted to the unique challenges of street fighting in Berlin. Infantry squads moved cautiously, using buildings for cover while maintaining interlocking fields of fire. Tanks were directed to knock down walls and barricades, allowing troops to advance through shattered structures. Engineers disarmed mines and cleared booby-trapped corridors, often at great personal risk. Communication between units was maintained through runners, signal flares, and portable radios. Luftwaffe aircraft were virtually absent, leaving German defenders without close air support to counter Soviet movements. The Red Army used psychological warfare as well, broadcasting surrender demands and emphasizing the inevitability of Soviet victory. Despite heavy casualties, momentum favored the attackers, whose numerical superiority and combined arms coordination allowed them to seize buildings in successive waves. Civilians witnessing the relentless advance faced a mixture of awe, fear, and resignation. The urban landscape, now a mixture of fire, smoke, and rubble, became a continuous front line with no clear rear lines. As the first blocks of the city were cleared, the intensity of combat escalated dramatically. Fighting became increasingly personal and brutal, with grenades thrown through windows and doorways, and bayonets used in narrow hallways. Soviet soldiers cleared buildings floor by floor, often encountering hidden snipers, machine gun nests, or civilians caught in the crossfire. The soundscape was overwhelming. Artillery crashes, machine gun bursts, shouting, and the screams of the wounded. German defenders adapted by using the city's terrain to their advantage, establishing strongpoints in collapsed buildings, subways, and underground passages. Civilians struggled to navigate streets, often guided by intuition or desperate chance to avoid combat zones. Fires continued to spread, fueled by broken gas lines and incendiary munitions, creating pockets of deadly heat and smoke. Both attackers and defenders suffered immense losses, highlighting the unrelenting human cost of urban warfare. Commanders on both sides faced mounting pressure, balancing the need to hold or advance with the preservation of men and resources. By the close of the first Soviet assault, the outer districts of Berlin had been transformed into a chaotic, smoldering battlefield. The first assault into Berlin marked the beginning of a relentless, day-by-day struggle for the city. Soviet forces had breached outer defenses, but every street and building now required careful clearing to secure permanent control. German defenders, though increasingly disorganized, inflicted sufficient casualties to slow the Red Army, demonstrating the lethal effectiveness of urban defensive tactics. Civilians endured an unending nightmare, caught between shelling, firefights, and the destruction of their homes. Supply shortages, fires, and debris compounded the danger, creating a cityscape that tested human endurance to the limits. Psychological strain was enormous, as fear, fatigue, and grief became constant companions. Communication, coordination, and adaptability determined survival and success, with units on both sides improvising under extreme conditions. The Soviet offensive, though inexorable, revealed the staggering costs of capturing a city built for both habitation and defense. By the end of the first phase, Berlin was no longer a capital city in the conventional sense. It was a fragmented battlefield, a labyrinth of ruin, where every step forward demanded immense sacrifice. The stage was set for an extended and horrific siege, as block-by-block fighting became the grim reality of the Battle of Berlin. As Soviet forces penetrated deeper into Berlin, the city transformed into an inferno of street fighting, with each block presenting a deadly gauntlet. Snipers perched in shattered buildings, attics, and chimneys inflicted constant casualties, forcing advancing infantry to move cautiously and in tightly coordinated squads. Barricades of rubble, overturned vehicles, and sandbags turned streets into kill zones, channeling attackers into areas pre-sighted by defenders. Flames from burning buildings spread unpredictably, consuming homes, shops, and factories alike, while thick black smoke obscured vision and coated lungs with soot. Flamethrower teams became invaluable, clearing fortified positions with terrifying efficiency, but their use also drove panic and civilian casualties. Tanks lurched forward through debris-strewn avenues, their tracks crushing rubble and bodies alike, while their main guns flattened fortified positions. German soldiers and Volkssturm units launched counterattacks from cellars and side streets, often engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Civilians, many of them elderly or children, were caught between shellfire and falling masonry, seeking shelter in basements that offered little protection from sustained bombardment. The soundscape was a symphony of war: explosions, machine guns, shouts, screams, and the creaking of damaged structures. By the end of each day, Streets were almost unrecognizable, reduced to twisted metal, shattered stone, and the detritus of urban warfare. Urban combat in Berlin demanded constant improvisation from Soviet soldiers. Infantry teams coordinated closely with tanks, using small arms and explosives to flush defenders from ruined buildings. Engineers cleared minefields, demolished barricades, and opened narrow passages for assaulting troops. Every intersection became a lethal trap, with German snipers and hidden machine gun nests waiting to ambush the unprepared. Flamethrower units were deployed to clear entrenched positions, often advancing alongside infantry, while the tanks provided suppressive fire. The city's underground tunnels and basements became hideouts for German troops, requiring Soviet forces to engage in methodical clearing operations that could last hours. Civilians trapped within buildings faced extreme danger, with fire, smoke, and crossfire rendering escape routes hazardous or impossible. Communication between units relied on runners, signal flares, and field radios, but constant chaos often broke coordination. Each street conquered was immediately transformed into a defensive point to prevent counterattacks. The psychological toll on soldiers and civilians alike was immense, with fear and exhaustion blending into a relentless, all-encompassing pressure. But German defenders exploited the city's ruins with ruthless precision. Snipers moved between shattered buildings, often indistinguishable from rubble, until a single shot revealed their presence. Barricades of furniture, rubble, and sandbags were continuously reinforced, creating complex defensive layers. Panzerfaust teams emerged from cellar openings to target approaching tanks, while machine guns sprayed streets with lethal efficiency. Flamethrowers and incendiary devices were used both by Soviets and Germans to clear or hold buildings, adding to the pervasive fires that consumed entire blocks. Civilians were forced to navigate these dangers daily, attempting to avoid sniper fire, burning debris, and collapsing structures. Soviet tanks, while powerful, were vulnerable to ambush in narrow streets, and infantry units had to provide close protection. The network of streets, alleys, and ruined buildings turned the city into a labyrinth where the distinction between combatant and civilian space was blurred. Fires raged unchecked in many districts, turning the urban battlefield into a landscape of heat, smoke, and terror. The fight for each block was slow, bloody, and unrelenting, underscoring the totality of urban warfare in the final days of the Third Reich. Soviet forces relied heavily on combined arms tactics to overcome German defenses. Infantry advanced under the cover of tanks and artillery, while engineers cleared barricades and explosive traps. Flamethrower teams were paired with small units to root out entrenched defenders, hiding in basements and upper floors. Snipers were systematically neutralized by coordinated fire, smoke screens, or direct assaults, but the risk of ambush remained constant. Civilians trapped in the crossfire were often forced to flee into adjacent streets, only to encounter additional fighting. Streets became narrow death corridors, where each step could trigger mines, gunfire, or falling debris. Communication lines between Soviet units were tenuous, with radio failures and intercepted messages compounding confusion. Despite these challenges, the Red Army steadily advanced, capturing streets and squares one by one. Fires from previous bombardments and combat spread unpredictably, creating additional hazards for both soldiers and civilians. By evening, contested districts were riddled with bodies, shattered infrastructure, and the lingering stench of smoke and blood. Byzantines. Hand-to-hand combat became a common feature of urban warfare in Berlin. Infantry units often engaged German defenders in stairwells, cellars, and collapsed buildings, using bayonets, pistols, and even improvised clubs. Tanks, though powerful, could not clear every building, requiring infantry to follow closely and secure every floor. Barricades were frequently rebuilt overnight, demonstrating the Germans' determination to slow the Soviet advance at any cost. Sniper positions were particularly lethal, forcing units to advance cautiously and methodically. Civilians faced near impossible choices: remain hidden in precarious basements or risk exposure by fleeing to supposedly safer areas. Artillery and small arms fire caused walls to crumble unpredictably, collapsing roofs and killing anyone inside. Flamethrower teams were essential in clearing fortified buildings, but were themselves prime targets for defenders. Coordination among Soviet infantry, tanks, engineers, and flamethrower units was essential for progress. Each block captured was immediately fortified to prevent German counterattacks. The pace of the battle was relentless, with the city's destruction escalating hour by hour. The psychological toll on both defenders and attackers was profound. Soviet soldiers faced continuous stress, moving through a city riddled with death, fire, and the constant threat of ambush. German defenders, often teenagers or elderly men, endured constant bombardment, house-to-house fighting, and the knowledge that escape was nearly impossible. Civilians lived in fear of sniper fire, artillery, and sudden fires, often huddling in basements for hours or days. Explosions created shockwaves that shattered windows, doors, and nerves, while the stench of burning buildings and human remains filled the air. Commanders on both sides had to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and under immense pressure. Supply lines were perilous, with every street potentially lethal for runners, vehicles, and ammunition convoys. Communication breakdowns often led to isolated units, fighting alone in devastated neighborhoods. The use of flamethrowers, explosives, and heavy artillery in close quarters blurred ethical lines and escalated human suffering. Every victory came at tremendous cost, with streets littered with the dead and wounded. Morale fluctuated wildly, with courage, fear, desperation, and fatigue intertwining in a chaotic psychological landscape. The urban terrain forced a re-evaluation of tactics by Soviet commanders. Tanks were paired with infantry to clear barricades and protect against panzer-fast attacks. Engineers specialized in demolitions and clearing mines became indispensable, allowing forces to advance through heavily fortified streets. Smoke, fire, and the constant risk of ambush created a dynamic battlefield where adaptability was critical. Street by street, building by building, the Soviets pushed forward despite casualties and disorganization. Civilians were increasingly used as guides or forced labor by desperate German units, further complicating ethical considerations. Snipers, concealed in rubble or hidden upper floors, slowed advances and caused heavy losses. Flamethrowers and explosives provided the only reliable means to clear certain fortified positions. Communication was maintained through runners, flares, and makeshift signals, highlighting the improvisational nature of urban combat. Despite chaos and carnage, Soviet forces steadily reduced German resistance in each sector. By the end of these initial days, much of central Berlin remained contested, but the Soviets held an unbroken line into the city's core. By the close of the early phase of street fighting, Berlin had become a fragmented, burning labyrinth of death and ruin. Each block told a story of brutal combat, with collapsed buildings, scorched streets, and the bodies of soldiers and civilians alike strewn across every avenue. The use of flamethrowers, tanks, explosives, and small arms made every street a miniature battlefield where survival depended on tactics, courage, and often luck. Snipers, barricades, and improvised defenses transformed the city into a near-impenetrable fortress despite dwindling German forces. Civilians endured unrelenting trauma, trapped in basements, shelters, and rubble-strewn streets. Soviet soldiers faced exhaustion, fear, and relentless combat stress as they advanced through this urban hellscape. Coordination between infantry, armor, and engineers was critical to overcoming the complex network of resistance. Fires and smoke continued to rage, obscuring vision and creating deadly hazards. Every gain was paid for in blood, while the city itself became both battlefield and victim. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, the push toward Berlin's symbolic and strategic heart, where the fate of the Third Reich would be decided. The Reichstag, looming over the battered city, had become the ultimate symbol of Nazi power and the focus of the Red Army's relentless assault. Its massive stone facade, once a proud emblem of German democracy, now bore the scars of air raids, artillery shells, and street battles. Soviet commanders recognized that capturing this monumental building would carry not only strategic significance, but immense propaganda value. Soldiers advancing through the streets approached with caution, knowing that every barricade, sniper, and machine gun nest along the way could exact a deadly toll. Flamethrower teams and sappers worked methodically, clearing cellars, stairwells, and fortified rooms to create safe paths for advancing troops. Tanks provided cover and heavy firepower, smashing through debris and shelling fortified positions, while infantry moved alongside, securing every inch. Civilians trapped in nearby buildings were forced to flee or take cover, often witnessing the carnage unfold from shattered windows. Smoke and fire obscured vision, while explosions from both Soviet artillery and desperate German defenders shook the ground with terrifying intensity. The approach to the Reichstag became a series of brutal encounters, with street fighting giving way to room-to-room combat within the building's shattered wings. Every step forward was a mixture of tactical precision, raw courage, and the relentless push of an army determined to seize its prize. Inside the Reichstag, chaos and destruction had reached a fevered pitch. Ceiling beams collapsed under bombardment, sending clouds of dust and splinters into the corridors below. Rooms were littered with the remnants of office equipment, shattered furniture, and personal effects left behind by fleeing officials. German defenders, increasingly desperate, used the ruins as defensive strongpoints, firing from shattered windows, stairwells, and hidden alcoves. Soviet sappers cleared entryways of mines and improvised explosives, often under direct fire from entrenched positions. Flamethrower units advanced cautiously, methodically flushing defenders from basements and upper floors, while tanks provided suppressive fire outside. Communication among Soviet units relied on runners and field radios, ensuring coordination despite the chaos. Snipers remained a persistent threat, concealed amidst the rubble, targeting anyone attempting to enter exposed areas. Civilians trapped inside or nearby watched in horror, often immobilized by fear and the constant risk of crossfire. The building's immense size meant that clearing operations were painstakingly slow, each room representing a potential death trap. Despite the danger, Soviet troops pressed forward, driven by both duty and the symbolic importance of the Reichstag's capture. The exterior of the Reichstag was a battlefield in its own right. Rubble-strewn streets formed natural barricades, with broken statues, sandbags, and destroyed vehicles serving as cover for German snipers. Soviet tanks maneuvered carefully, avoiding rubble that could immobilize their treads while firing on fortified positions from a distance. Artillery shells smashed through the upper floors, dislodging defenders and creating openings for infantry to advance. Flames engulfed adjacent buildings, creating walls of smoke that obscured movement and added to the surreal, apocalyptic atmosphere. Soldiers crawled through shattered courtyards, advancing under fire, while coordinating with engineers to dismantle obstacles. Each entrance, each window, and each hallway was fiercely contested, with small arms fire and explosives raining down continuously. Civilians were often caught in narrow alleys or basements, experiencing the horror of war from a confined, terrifying vantage point. Communication between units was vital, as isolated groups risked annihilation if cut off from reinforcements. Slowly, methodically, the Red Army encroached on the Reichstag, turning the surrounding area into a deadly chessboard of tactics and human endurance. German defenders, recognizing the symbolic importance of the Reichstag, fought with desperate determination. Snipers shifted positions constantly, exploiting every shadow and rubble heap to harass advancing Soviet troops. Machine guns were emplaced in shattered walls, doorways, and stairwells, providing overlapping fields of fire that slowed the Red Army's progress. Flamethrowers and grenades were met with countermeasures as defenders dug into basements and upper floors to escape direct confrontation. Tanks were ambushed in narrow alleys by Panzerfaust teams hidden behind barricades and rubble piles. Each room cleared by Soviet forces was immediately fortified to prevent counterattacks, creating a dynamic, fluid battle environment. Explosions from artillery and improvised charges shook walls and ceilings, sending clouds of dust and debris into soldiers' eyes and lungs. Civilians trapped within the city were often pressed into service by German units, further blurring lines between combatants and non-combatants. Communication breakdowns created confusion and occasional friendly fire incidents, adding to the chaotic atmosphere. Yet, despite fierce resistance, the Soviet advance continued inexorably, propelled by a mixture of strategic necessity and symbolic ambition. The central hall of the Reichstag became the focus of some of the fiercest fighting. High ceilings and wide corridors offered ample cover for defenders, while Soviet forces had to navigate under fire through twisted furniture and shattered flooring. Engineers cleared the way of mines and booby traps, while flamethrowers were used to dislodge German troops from concealed positions. Snipers remained hidden in upper windows, forcing Soviet soldiers to move in coordinated bursts between cover points. Tanks provided suppressive fire from the exterior, targeting barricades and fortified rooms to minimize Soviet casualties. Each room taken was immediately secured, with soldiers establishing defensive positions against potential counterattacks. Civilians nearby were forced to huddle in basements or rubble, witnessing the destruction of a building that had once symbolized order and authority. Explosions and collapsing masonry added to the disorienting chaos, making every advance both physically and psychologically exhausting. The pace of combat was relentless, with every corridor cleared inch by inch. Despite exhaustion and danger, Soviet units pressed forward, aware that the Reichstag's capture would mark a decisive turning point in the final days of the war. Soviet leadership understood the propaganda value of the Reichstag, emphasizing its capture as a demonstration of victory over Nazism. Political officers moved alongside combat units, documenting the assault with cameras and notes for immediate dissemination. Flags were prepared for hoisting upon the building's completion, symbolizing both military and ideological triumph. Units were rotated carefully to maintain momentum, with fresh soldiers replacing those who had endured prolonged exposure to gunfire, smoke, and rubble. The building's upper floors remained contested, requiring repeated assaults and careful coordination between infantry and engineers. Civilians caught in adjacent streets continued to face danger from stray fire, collapsing masonry, and smoke inhalation. Every corridor and hallway became a microcosm of the larger war, blending tactics, courage, desperation, and chaos. Supplies of ammunition, food, and medical care were limited, yet soldiers adapted, sharing resources and improvising under extreme conditions. Artillery and mortar fire continued to pound external walls, weakening structural defenses and aiding infantry advances. By the evening, Soviet forces controlled the lower floors and courtyards, setting the stage for the final push to the building's roof. The symbolic moment approached as Soviet soldiers ascended to the Reichstag's upper floors and roof. Stairwells were littered with debris, bodies, and makeshift traps designed to slow progress. Flamethrowers, grenades, and close-quarters combat cleared defenders from their final positions. Soldiers moved in small teams, covering each other as they navigated through destroyed offices, council chambers, and hallways. The building's roof, partially collapsed from artillery fire, presented a challenging ascent, requiring coordination and courage under constant threat. Snipers continued to target exposed troops, making the climb both physically demanding and psychologically taxing. The view from the roof revealed a city in flames, with smoke rising from devastated streets and iconic landmarks obscured by fire. Soviet engineers secured the roof, providing a platform for hoisting the red flag that would symbolize ultimate victory. Civilians watched in awe and terror from surrounding streets and basements, understanding that the war's symbolic conclusion was near. The final ascent combined military skill, determination, and the unrelenting momentum of an army bent on capturing the heart of Berlin. When the red flag was finally raised atop the Reichstag, it marked both a tactical and symbolic triumph. The building, once a monument to German power, now bore the insignia of Soviet victory, signaling the imminent collapse of Nazi Berlin. Soldiers cheered, exhausted yet elated, aware that their efforts had combined strategy, courage, and immense human cost. Smoke still obscured parts of the city, but the capture of this central landmark sent a clear message: the Third Reich's power was broken. The streets below, filled with the remnants of combat, civilian suffering, and burning buildings, testified to the ferocity of the battle. Commanders documented the achievement for propaganda and historical record, knowing the significance of the image would resonate worldwide. German defenders, many trapped in the remaining ruins, recognized that resistance had become futile. Civilians cautiously emerged from basements and shelters, witnessing firsthand the symbolic moment that signaled the end of the regime. The Reichstag, scarred and battered, stood as a testament to the brutality of urban warfare and the determination of the Red Army. In capturing this monumental structure, the Soviets achieved a victory that was both strategic and emblematic, defining the final chapter of Berlin's fall. As the Red Army closed in on central Berlin, the city's defenses became a patchwork of regular SS troops, hastily organized Volkssturm units, and adolescent Hitler Youth thrust into combat. The SS, trained and hardened by years of ideological and battlefield conditioning, formed the backbone of organized resistance, coordinating small, disciplined groups of fighters in strategic strongpoints across the city. Volkssturm battalions, composed largely of middle-aged men and teenagers, lacked formal training but were motivated by fear, duty, and Nazi propaganda that painted the Soviets as monstrous invaders. Hitler Youth, sometimes barely in their teens, were armed with rifles, pistols, and even captured weapons, indoctrinated to fight to the last breath for the Führer. Streets were littered with barricades constructed from rubble, furniture, and abandoned vehicles, creating deadly choke points that slowed the Soviet advance. Civilians, trapped amidst the chaos, were forced to flee basements and cellars, or risk being caught in the crossfire, often carrying supplies or assisting in makeshift fortifications. SS commanders drilled the Volkssturm and youth units in rudimentary tactics, emphasizing ambushes, sniper positions, and improvised explosives. Fear, propaganda, and desperation fused into a chaotic blend of resistance, with every street corner a potential death trap. Fires from artillery strikes and street fighting illuminated the night, casting an eerie glow over the defenders' faces, a mixture of determination and terror. Despite their lack of training, These irregular forces inflicted sporadic casualties, slowing but never halting the Red Army's inexorable advance. In some neighborhoods, entire streets were turned into defensive fortresses by Volkssturm and Hitler Youth units working alongside seasoned SS veterans. Sandbags, overturned vehicles, and piles of debris created maze-like choke points, funneling Soviet soldiers into kill zones where machine guns and snipers could maximize their effectiveness. Urban warfare was brutal and intimate. Every basement, cellar, and doorway became a defensive position, often occupied by men and boys barely old enough to shave. Civilians were forced to navigate these streets under the constant threat of crossfire, sometimes pressed into service as messengers, stretcher-bearers, or lookouts. Molotov cocktails, grenades, and improvised explosives were stockpiled to counter the advancing Soviet tanks, though poorly aimed or mishandled devices frequently harmed the defenders themselves. The SS issued orders emphasizing ideological fervor, instructing units to fight to the last man, and instilling a fanatical sense of duty among the Hitler Youth. Tensions were high, as older Volkssturm fighters resented taking orders from adolescent commanders, and SS officers struggled to impose discipline on ill-prepared civilians. Smoke from burning buildings, punctuated by flashes from rifle and artillery fire, shrouded the streets in a hellish haze. Fear permeated every corner, yet a perverse sense of duty pushed the defenders onward, each man, boy, and elderly fighter clinging to the belief that Berlin could still be saved. As night fell, sporadic firefights and explosions made the city a patchwork of chaos, with survival dependent on courage, luck, and sheer determination. The SS, aware of their tactical advantage in training and experience, attempted to integrate the Volkssturm and Hitler Youth into structured defensive lines. Orders were given to hold key intersections, bridges, and government buildings at all costs, with SS squads reinforcing weak points. Volkssturm units often manned barricades while under fire, using rifles, pistols, and a limited supply of captured machine guns. Hitler Youth were deployed in reconnaissance, couriers, and forward observation roles, their small stature allowing them to navigate rubble-strewn streets with relative agility. Street-to-street fighting was unrelenting, with defenders ambushing Soviet units from hidden positions, often disappearing into rubble after each engagement. Civilians watched in horror as friends, family, and neighbors were dragged into the conflict, some forced into participation while others hid silently, praying for survival. Explosions shook buildings, collapsing walls and ceilings, while smoke and dust filled lungs, creating a choking, disorienting environment. Morale varied widely. The SS maintained a cold, rigid resolve, while Volkssturm units were increasingly demoralized by casualties and the relentless advance of the enemy. Hitler Youth, indoctrinated and idealistic, displayed fanatical courage, sometimes charging into firefights with little regard for personal safety. This mixture of professional soldiers, untrained civilians, and ideologically conditioned adolescents created a chaotic yet determined defensive network throughout the city. So, as Soviet tanks rolled into the streets, improvisation became essential for the defenders. Panzerfausts and anti-tank mines were placed at choke points, while buildings were rigged with explosives to collapse on advancing armored vehicles. SS officers coordinated these efforts, directing the Volkssturm and youth units to optimal firing positions. Close-quarter fighting in buildings and alleyways became commonplace, with hand-to-hand combat often breaking out when Soviet infantry breached barricades. Civilians were caught in a deadly limbo, sometimes forced to flee through streets under fire or huddle in basements for hours at a time. Psychological strain was immense, as the constant roar of artillery and small arms fire, combined with cries of the wounded and burning buildings, created a terrifying urban battlefield. Discipline varied. While the SS enforced ruthless order, many Volkssturm units panicked under sustained attack, abandoning positions and leaving gaps for Soviet forces to exploit. Hitler Youth, in contrast, often held positions with obsessive determination, motivated by ideology and fear of reprisal. Every street corner was a potential trap, every building a battlefield, and every movement carried immense risk. Survival depended on coordination, courage, and the ability to adapt quickly to the fluid, deadly environment. In several districts, defensive efforts concentrated around vital infrastructure, such as bridges over canals, railway stations, and government offices. The SS established command posts, directing fire and allocating resources to areas of greatest threat. Volkssturm units, lacking experience, were sometimes relegated to supporting roles, reinforcing barricades, and assisting with ammunition distribution. Hitler Youth members acted as forward observers and runners, moving messages and supplies across exposed streets. Smoke, fire, and debris reduced visibility, forcing both defenders and attackers into a deadly, improvisational fight. Artillery from outside the city added additional chaos, collapsing weakened structures and scattering defenders. Despite being under constant pressure, SS officers emphasized propaganda and ideology, reminding troops of the symbolic significance of holding Berlin. Civilians, some forced to construct defenses or carry supplies, were increasingly traumatized by the constant bombardment. Coordination between the disparate units, professional soldiers, poorly trained civilians, and ideologically driven adolescents was challenging yet crucial to maintaining pockets of resistance. By maintaining their positions, defenders delayed the Soviet advance, buying time for Hitler's last-ditch hopes to linger. The psychological landscape of Berlin's defenders was as chaotic as the physical battlefield. Fear, desperation, and indoctrination intertwined, with each defender grappling with survival instincts and a fanatical sense of duty. SS soldiers, conditioned for brutal obedience, showed cold efficiency and relentless aggression. Volkssturm fighters struggled with inexperience, exhaustion, and the realization that the Soviet advance was unstoppable. Hitler Youth, indoctrinated to view surrender as treachery, often fought with reckless bravery, sometimes to their deaths. Civilians became unwilling witnesses and participants in this urban nightmare, their homes converted into barricades or shattered ruins. Fires from destroyed buildings illuminated the night, casting shadows over the defenders' faces, highlighting a spectrum of emotion from determination to sheer terror. Communication breakdowns and the disorientation of continuous bombardment further complicated defensive operations. Despite the chaos, pockets of resistance persisted, delaying Soviet advances and exacting a heavy toll. The city had become a crucible of human endurance, fanatical ideology, and unimaginable fear. Tiffin Ewell. Urban warfare tactics evolved as the battle dragged on. The SS established sniper nests and coordinated machine gun positions, maximizing their training advantage over ill-equipped Volkssturm and Hitler Youth units. Guerrilla-style ambushes in ruins and side streets became commonplace, allowing small groups to temporarily stall Soviet progress. Flamethrowers, grenades, and improvised explosives were essential in clearing fortified buildings. Civilians, trapped in basements or rubble, often endured hours of terror as firefights raged above them. Coordination between different units, professional SS Volkssturm and Hitler Youth, was difficult but necessary to maintain coherent defense lines. Casualties mounted rapidly, with bodies littering streets and buildings, a grim testament to the ferocity of the fighting. Morale fluctuated wildly, from the determined fanaticism of the SS to the terrified, trembling resolve of untrained Volkssturm fighters. Some Hitler Youth leaders rallied small groups with ideological zeal, inspiring temporary surges of courage amidst chaos. The constant threat of artillery, sniper fire, and urban ambushes created an environment of perpetual tension and fear. Every building, street, and barricade became a focal point for combat, shaping the desperate defense of Berlin. By the final days, Berlin's defenders were reduced to a desperate mixture of ideology, fear, and sheer survival instinct. SS units, though diminished in number, remained disciplined and lethal, acting as anchors in a collapsing defense network. Volkssturm fighters were exhausted, disoriented, and increasingly resigned to the inevitability of defeat. Yet some continued to man barricades and fight despite overwhelming odds. Hitler Youth, indoctrinated to the last, sometimes charged into firefights with near-suicidal fervor, unwilling to abandon their posts. Civilians, witnessing and enduring the destruction, were caught in an unending cycle of terror and displacement. In the final days of April 1945, the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery became the epicenter of a crumbling empire, a subterranean tomb echoing with panic, despair, and fanaticism. Adolf Hitler, isolated from reality, immersed himself in a delusional haze, convinced that Berlin could yet be held and that phantom armies from the west and north would somehow relieve the city. Staff officers, generals, and ministers crowded the claustrophobic quarters, many exhausted, famished, and haunted by the sounds of artillery and street fighting above. Hitler's voice, once commanding, now oscillated between fury and despair, laced with apocalyptic visions of betrayal and martyrdom. Maps of non-existent troop movements littered the table as he barked orders to divisions that had long ceased to exist, demanding counterattacks that were physically impossible. Propaganda officers reinforced the delusion, reporting on supposed reinforcements and miracle weapons that had no chance of materializing. Eva Braun, increasingly isolated yet loyal, remained a silent presence, attempting to temper his rants while sharing in the psychological collapse of their shared world. Staff tried to interpret the Führer's directives, knowing that obedience could be meaningless yet disobedience deadly, as Hitler's paranoia intensified with each failed report from the front. Outside the bunker, the Red Army's guns shook the city, shaking walls and shattering illusions, while inside, Hitler continued to cling to fantasies of ultimate victory. The tension was suffocating, a volatile mixture of fear, loyalty, and impending doom that permeated every corner of the underground complex. Hitler's inner circle, once a cohesive if ideologically extreme body, fragmented under the weight of reality, exhaustion, and fear. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, oscillated between grim realism and a feverish desire to maintain morale, desperately trying to reassure Hitler of the loyalty of the German people. Martin Bormann, his secretary and manipulator, maintained rigid order in the bunker, managing information, rationing supplies, and reinforcing the Führer's sense of control, despite knowing the situation was hopeless. Generals such as Wilhelm Burgdorf and Hans Krebs attempted to deliver candid reports on the impossibility of his orders, only to be met with rage, recrimination, and threats of execution. Hitler's obsession with phantom divisions led him to issue frantic directives for counterattacks, asking for reinforcements from units that had been destroyed or cut off for weeks. He meticulously dictated last wills, military promotions, and posthumous honors, revealing an obsessive need to control his legacy even as the city above crumbled. Rumors of betrayal and defeatism among his staff were met with accusations of treachery, further eroding trust and driving paranoia to new heights. Hitler's health, both physical and mental, deteriorated visibly as fatigue, malnutrition, and psychological strain manifested in tremors, rash outbursts, and incoherent tirades. The bunker's atmosphere was electric with fear, each staff member acutely aware that the collapse of Berlin, and with it the Third Reich, was imminent. Every day, the tension between obedience, survival, and reality created a psychological pressure cooker that would soon explode in the final acts of the Führer's life. The Führer's rants often focused on phantom armies, supernatural rescue forces, and the imagined loyalty of far-flung divisions. He demanded that generals report precise movements of units that no longer existed, scribbling frantic notes on maps and issuing contradictory orders within hours. Berlin was surrounded, communications were disrupted, and yet Hitler insisted on detailed plans for offensives that were strategically impossible. The SS and remaining Wehrmacht officers were ordered to hold positions at all costs, even in sectors already overrun by Soviet troops. Hitler's obsession with honor and the symbolic defense of the capital led to extreme measures, including forbidding retreat and instructing the Volkssturm and Hitler Youth to fight to the last man. He alternated between tirades against perceived incompetence and passionate declarations of loyalty to his vision of Germany's eternal greatness. Daily briefings became exercises in futility, with generals struggling to translate fantasy into orders that could no longer be executed. The bunker's residents often exchanged glances of disbelief and fear, realizing that each day of obedience carried no chance of survival or strategic success. Hitler's fixation on propaganda extended to insisting that the press report imaginary victories and morale-boosting achievements. This delusional management of perception versus reality intensified the psychological strain on all who remained in the underground labyrinth. Eva Braun, confined to the bunker with Hitler and a small entourage, observed the disintegration of the Führer and his inner circle firsthand. Though largely shielded from military briefings, she witnessed the relentless stress, erratic behavior, and obsessive attention to trivial details that characterized Hitler's last days. Attempts to comfort him, however small, were met with fleeting gratitude or sudden anger as he vacillated between despair and fanaticism. She became a confidant, listening to ideological rants, participating in intimate conversations about Germany's fate, and enduring the claustrophobic atmosphere alongside staff and generals. Braun's presence offered a measure of humanity amidst a bunker steeped in fear, paranoia, and death. Rumors of her influence on Hitler's mood were debated among staff, though her actual impact remained subtle, often limited to quiet support in an environment dominated by obsession and rage. As the Soviets breached outer districts of Berlin, the bunker's atmosphere became increasingly claustrophobic, with the sound of artillery, street fighting, and collapsing buildings reverberating above. Each day, the contrast between Hitler's delusions and the reality outside became starker, deepening the sense of imminent collapse. Orders for counterattacks and heroic last stands contrasted sharply with the dwindling manpower and shattered infrastructure visible in reports from the front. Braun's patience and quiet presence became a stabilizing factor amid the psychological maelstrom that gripped the bunker's occupants. Joseph Goebbels played a dual role as propagandist and reluctant realist, attempting to manage Hitler's obsession with phantom victories while maintaining ideological fervor. He crafted speeches and directives, emphasizing loyalty and sacrifice, even as he recognized the futility of defending a city surrounded and collapsing. Goebbels' influence was limited. Hitler's paranoia and rigid adherence to ideology often overrode any rational counsel offered by his ministers. He frequently attempted to inspire defenders and civilians, creating slogans, symbols, and propaganda messages aimed at galvanizing morale. Within the bunker, however, he faced the stark reality of shortages, exhaustion, and the imminent collapse of German defences. Discussions with Hitler often turned tense, with the Führer oscillating between approving Goebbels' plans and denouncing them as treasonous or inadequate. As the days passed, Goebbels grew increasingly aware that survival was impossible, and his actions shifted toward managing the final legacy of the Nazi regime. Coordination with the remaining military staff involved delivering unrealistic orders to already defeated units, a task that tested his composure and resolve. Despite the knowledge of defeat, Goebbels maintained a facade of ideological commitment, understanding that the Führer's collapse would also signify the end of his influence. Each day in the bunker was a blend of surreal devotion, fear, and the grim calculus of the Third Reich's final hours. Hitler's obsession with the defense of Berlin was intertwined with an unrelenting focus on loyalty, betrayal, and the purification of the Reich from internal dissent. Officers who suggested surrender, withdrawal, or pragmatic retreats were often berated, threatened, or dismissed, reinforcing the fanaticism that gripped the remaining defenders. Even as Soviet artillery devastated districts and bridges, Hitler issued directives as if the city remained fully supplied and strategically intact. The psychological impact on the inner circle was profound. Generals, ministers, and aides struggled to reconcile loyalty with the knowledge of impending annihilation. Panicked civilians, trapped within the city, became reluctant participants in defense preparations, often forced to carry ammunition, build barricades, or navigate deadly streets. SS officers executed brutal discipline, enforcing orders among the Volkssturm and Hitler Youth, sometimes with lethal consequences for disobedience or hesitation. The combination of ideological zeal, fear of reprisal, and hope for miraculous reinforcement kept the city's defences operational, though increasingly ineffective. Hitler's rants, orders, and proclamations became increasingly detached from reality, creating confusion and fatalistic compliance. Reports of non-existent victories, phantom divisions, and imagined breakthroughs were treated as critical intelligence, reflecting the total collapse of rational command. This final spiral of delusion and fanaticism set the stage for the ultimate implosion of the Nazi leadership within the bunker. Video. The physical and mental collapse of Hitler's inner circle was accelerated by starvation, exhaustion, and the constant psychological strain of imminent annihilation. Rationed food, minimal sleep, and continuous bombardment eroded the capacity for rational thought among generals and staff alike. Hitler's increasingly erratic behavior created a climate of fear where obedience became both a survival strategy and a participation in collective delusion. Officers and aides whispered about the inevitability of defeat, yet public dissent was impossible without severe repercussions. The intertwining of ideology and panic intensified, with Hitler projecting his fantasies of heroic last stands onto exhausted subordinates. Tactical plans were drawn, discarded, and redrawn based on imagined enemy movements, often contradicting prior orders within hours. Conversations were punctuated by sudden tirades, bursts of laughter, or despairing silences, reflecting the psychological fragmentation within the bunker. The constant bombardment from above, combined with reports of Soviet penetration into Berlin's districts, created a sensory environment of terror and chaos. Every directive, whether military, political, or personal, became a mix of delusion and desperation, revealing the fissures in the once commanding authority of the Führer. As the days dwindled, the inner circle's cohesion disintegrated, leaving only fanatical loyalty and helpless resignation in the face of history's end. Due earned fee. Following Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, the already fractured Nazi command structure spiraled into total disarray, with remaining officials scrambling to navigate a collapsing city. The Führerbunker, once a center of meticulous planning and authoritarian control, became a site of confusion, panic, and competing agendas among generals, ministers, and aides. Karl Donitz had been named Hitler's successor in the political testament, but his authority was geographically and operationally distant, leaving field commanders in Berlin effectively leaderless. Orders were contradictory, sporadic, and often ignored, as generals attempted to reconcile the impossible task of defending a city encircled by hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. Communications with other German commands were fragmented, disrupted by Allied air raids, destroyed infrastructure, and the chaotic retreat of units across the collapsing Reich. Some remaining officers considered surrender or negotiated localized truces, only to find that such proposals were either ignored or met with hostility by fanatical SS commanders. Fear, loyalty to ideology, and mistrust of one another paralyzed decision-making, creating deadly hesitation that cost lives on the streets. Civilians trapped in the city witnessed the visible signs of command breakdown, from abandoned barricades to uncoordinated firefights, further deepening chaos. Supplies dwindled rapidly, with food, ammunition, and medical aid running low, amplifying panic and desperation. Each hour brought further disintegration of coordination, leaving defenders to operate in isolation or small ad hoc groups. SS officers attempted to assert authority over remaining Wehrmacht units and Volkssturm battalions, but their influence was limited and inconsistent. Fanatical ideology clashed with the stark reality of military defeat, producing erratic enforcement of orders and sporadic defensive efforts. Some SS leaders executed anyone suspected of considering surrender, enforcing discipline with brutal, sometimes lethal, methods. Meanwhile, regular army officers struggled to maintain order among exhausted troops, many of whom had lost contact with higher command and were demoralized by the rapid Soviet advance. Attempts at coordinated counterattacks were quickly abandoned, as officers realized there was no operational coherence, and divisions were reduced to isolated pockets of resistance. Reports of phantom reinforcements continued to circulate, echoing Hitler's last delusional orders, causing further confusion and false hope among soldiers. The lack of unified command allowed Soviet forces to exploit weak points, advancing street by street with overwhelming firepower. Civilians, forced into defense roles by ideology or circumstance, often became informal messengers or aides in this fractured hierarchy. The sense of imminent doom pervaded every action, as each decision carried life or death consequences for both military personnel and trapped residents. Chaos, both psychological and operational, defined the final days of the Nazi leadership in Berlin. Generals such as Helmuth Weidling, commander of Berlin's defense, attempted to impose rational military order, issuing retreat directives, organizing last-minute barricades, and negotiating ceasefires where possible. His authority, however, was undermined by the fanatical SS, who refused to follow orders contrary to ideological doctrine. Miscommunication and deliberate obstruction created deadly conflicts between units attempting to coordinate, resulting in fragmented resistance across the city. Individual officers issued contradictory commands, sending troops into already overrun sectors or demanding counterattacks against impossible odds. The Volkssturm, composed largely of untrained civilians, relied on leadership that oscillated between strategic planning and irrational fanaticism. Hitler Youth, indoctrinated and fearless, often ignored any attempts at surrender or pragmatic retreat, exacerbating chaos. Each day, the lack of clear hierarchy led to spontaneous defensive actions, where small groups acted independently, sometimes with deadly consequences for civilians caught in crossfire. Ammunition shortages, collapsed communications, and exhausted troops compounded the breakdown, leaving the city's defense a patchwork of disjointed firefights. Attempts to consolidate command were further complicated by ideological zeal, personal rivalries, and the psychological collapse of individuals facing inevitable defeat. The overall effect was a city where orders were fluid, compliance inconsistent, and survival dependent on improvisation. There comes through propaganda offices, cut off from centralized directives, attempted to maintain morale by issuing bulletins and encouraging resistance, despite the clear futility of these messages. Reports of victories or heroic last stands were broadcast internally, sometimes even read aloud to troops and civilians, creating a surreal disconnect between reality and official communication. Many officers recognized the deception, but fear of reprisal, ideological loyalty, or habit compelled them to maintain the facade of obedience. As Soviet forces penetrated deeper into central districts, attempts at surrender, whether by individual units or localized groups, were often ignored or blocked by SS commanders intent on dying in place. Street fighting intensified as remaining defenders, without coherent leadership, fortified random positions, creating pockets of resistance that slowed but could not halt the Soviet advance. Civilian shelters became auxiliary command posts or makeshift hospitals, further blending military and civilian zones in chaotic urban warfare. Orders for heroic last stands were frequently disregarded or misinterpreted, leading to confusion and unnecessary casualties. The city became a labyrinth of independent skirmishes, with some units unknowingly duplicating defensive efforts or abandoning strategic points. This lack of centralized authority allowed Soviet reconnaissance and artillery to identify weak points and exploit gaps in defenses. Berlin's collapse was accelerated by the inability of Nazi officials to reconcile ideology with operational reality, leaving the city's fate to inevitability. Communications with surrounding German units were minimal, and any hope of coordinated reinforcement was extinguished by the rapid Soviet encirclement. Officers attempted to relay messages through runners, field radios, or dispatches, but many never reached their intended recipients due to artillery, chaos, or miscommunication. Fanatical SS leaders frequently intercepted messages, refusing to acknowledge orders that contradicted ideological directives or the cult of Hitler's last commands. As a result, troops often operated on outdated intelligence, unaware of the city's imminent fall or the futility of continued resistance. Rumors of approaching divisions from the west or north were treated as gospel by some, despite obvious impossibility, further confusing defensive strategy. Civilians pressed into service as couriers or assistants, risked death carrying messages across streets raked by artillery and small arms fire. Conflicting commands led to disastrous tactical situations, with counterattacks ordered in sectors already overrun, and barricades left unmanned where defenders had abandoned posts. The collapse of German communication highlighted the disintegration of command authority, leaving local initiative and improvisation as the only survival mechanisms. Soviet forces exploited these gaps with methodical precision, isolating defenders and systematically advancing through the urban labyrinth. The failure to coordinate surrender or withdrawal left the city to burn in chaos, a testament to the fatal consequences of command breakdown. Even as surrender became a practical necessity, ideological fanaticism prevented most remaining officials from considering it seriously. SS commanders often viewed negotiation or capitulation as betrayal, enforcing strict adherence to the fight to the last man doctrine. Civilians attempting to communicate with Soviet forces were frequently stopped, threatened, or shot by nervous and fanatical troops. Generals and aides, who recognized the hopelessness of their situation, attempted unofficial truces or partial withdrawals, but coordination with other units was nearly impossible. Mistrust between the SS, Wehrmacht remnants, Volkssturm, and Hitler Youth exacerbated paralysis, leaving pockets of resistance isolated and under constant attack. Artillery, tank fire, and street-to-street combat created a deadly feedback loop, with chaos above reinforcing indecision below. Conflicting objectives, survival, ideological adherence, and command loyalty produced an operational gridlock, slowing any effective response. Exhaustion, starvation, and psychological strain eroded discipline among remaining forces, while fanatical obedience preserved the illusion of cohesion. Each moment became a balance between improvisation and fear, survival and ideological duty, producing an environment of relentless tension. By early May, Berlin was effectively leaderless, a city defended by fragments of its own decimated command structure. Small groups of officers attempted to negotiate localized ceasefires or surrender to Soviet troops, but such attempts were frequently blocked or ignored by higher-ranking SS officials. The lack of central authority meant that decisions made in one district had no impact elsewhere, leaving adjacent areas to continue fighting blindly. Orders issued by the bunker's surviving staff often contradicted one another, further paralyzing defensive action. Fear of retribution from ideological zealots prevented many from acting decisively, while Soviet artillery and infantry continued systematic advances. Communication networks, already fragmented, collapsed completely, leaving units reliant on word of mouth and sporadic visual signals. Disconnected from supply lines, troops ran out of ammunition, medical aid, and basic necessities, weakening both morale and combat effectiveness. Civilian populations, pressed into service or hiding among fighters, suffered disproportionately as command failures left them exposed to indiscriminate fire. Some SS units persisted in fanatic defense, oblivious to the overall collapse, while others deserted or surrendered, highlighting the chaotic divergence of behavior. The combination of ideological rigidity, fear, and lack of coordination produced a fractured and ultimately doomed defense. The disintegration of command left Berlin as a city of fragmented resistance, unable to orchestrate meaningful military action. By May 2, 1945, command breakdown had reached its final stage, with the city effectively leaderless and the remaining Nazi officials unable to influence the course of events. SS fanatics continued isolated resistance, while the Volkssturm and Hitler Youth units either surrendered, deserted, or fought sporadically without coordination. Generals who had attempted rational planning recognized that any organized resistance was impossible, and survival became the primary goal. Civilians, trapped amidst combat, faced indiscriminate artillery, sniper fire, and collapsing buildings, reflecting the tragic consequences of command failure. Soviet forces methodically consolidated control over sectors, encountering fragmented pockets of defenders incapable of cohesive response. As April waned into the final days of the Third Reich, the Reichstag emerged as the symbolic and strategic heart of Berlin, its massive structure battered by months of relentless bombardment. Soviet forces, recognizing the political and psychological significance of the building, concentrated artillery, infantry, and engineer units for a final assault. Smoke and dust from shelling shrouded the surrounding streets, reducing visibility to mere meters and turning the approach into a hazardous gauntlet. German defenders, composed of SS troops, Volkssturm units, and Hitler Youth fanatics, fortified the Reichstag with barricades snipers, and strategically positioned machine guns. The building's interior had been transformed into a labyrinth of improvised defenses, collapsed walls, rubble piles, and booby traps, created deadly choke points for advancing Soviet soldiers. Each corridor became a killing field, with German troops firing from hidden niches and floors above, turning the structure into a vertical battlefield. Tanks and infantry attempted coordinated advances, only to be repelled by Panzerfausts and well-aimed machine gun fire. Civilians, largely absent due to the extreme danger, could only observe from distant streets, witnessing the massive explosions, fire and smoke rising from the historic seat of German power. Communication between Soviet units was challenged by rubble, sniper fire, and collapsing stairwells, yet momentum pressed inexorably toward the Reichstag. The assault would become a crucible of urban warfare, blending strategy, fanaticism, and sheer human endurance. Soviet infantry moved cautiously through the shattered city blocks surrounding the Reichstag, clearing buildings that had been turned into strongpoints by desperate German defenders. Mortar fire and artillery strikes targeted known positions, while sappers attempted to clear mines and improvised explosives along main avenues. Snipers from both sides engaged in deadly duels, often firing from shattered windows, rooftops, or behind walls that were barely standing. Panzer units provided suppressive fire, attempting to neutralize entrenched machine gun nests and facilitate infantry movement. German defenders, though outnumbered and outgunned, displayed remarkable tenacity, using knowledge of the building's interior to conduct ambushes and counterattacks. Debris, fire, and smoke created chaotic conditions, causing confusion and disorientation among attacking units. Orders from Soviet command emphasized speed and coordination, but urban warfare reduced conventional tactics to improvisation and individual initiative. Each floor cleared often revealed more resistance, with German soldiers retreating to higher levels or collapsing stairwells to slow the enemy. Communication between assault teams relied on signals, shouted commands, and couriers navigating a lethal landscape of rubble and gunfire. The assault was slow, methodical, and brutally costly, with every room fought over as if it were a separate battlefield. Inside the Reichstag, fighting was ferocious and intimate, with soldiers on both sides engaging in hand-to-hand combat amid shattered furniture, broken statues, and smoldering debris. Grenades were tossed down stairwells, rifles fired from doorways, and flamethrowers used to clear entrenched positions. German defenders, driven by fanaticism and desperation, staged counterattacks from hidden alcoves and partially destroyed chambers. Soviet troops cleared floors systematically, moving room by room, often paying a heavy price in casualties for each advance. Smoke from burning debris, combined with dust from collapsed walls, created suffocating conditions, obscuring vision and coating lungs. Engineers were forced to clear barricades and booby traps under fire, adding to the lethality of the assault. Each engagement required improvisation, courage, and split-second decision-making, with soldiers using debris for cover and makeshift weapons when conventional arms failed. Stairwells and corridors became choke points, with fire, gunfire, and explosions echoing like thunder through the building. The Reichstag, once a symbol of legislative authority, had become a vertical battlefield of brutal urban combat. Every corner turned, every doorway breached, reflected the physical and psychological intensity of the struggle for the building. The Soviet command emphasized the symbolic importance of raising the red banner atop the Reichstag, a psychological victory as crucial as the physical capture of the building. Forward detachments pressed relentlessly upward, often encountering fierce resistance on the upper floors. Smoke and flames from artillery strikes above and below mingled with dust, reducing visibility to mere inches in many areas. German defenders rigged collapsing walls and stairwells to impede the attackers, forcing soldiers to risk concentrated fire as they advanced. Snipers on higher floors attempted to disrupt Soviet movement, creating deadly kill zones that required careful tactical planning to neutralize. Explosions from grenades and artillery struck intermittently, shaking debris from ceilings and toppling weakened walls. Soviet infantry displayed remarkable coordination under these conditions, using small unit tactics, suppressive fire and flamethrowers to secure each level. Injured soldiers were dragged to relative safety where possible, though medical support was minimal and evacuation routes dangerous. Engineers continued clearing booby traps and barricades to ensure supply and communication lines remained open. Momentum toward the roof and central dome of the Reichstag became increasingly tense, as every floor captured was another step toward historic victory. Raising the red banner required not only physical dominance of the roof, but also complete clearance of upper floors, a process complicated by German snipers and last-ditch defenders. The Soviet assault teams advanced in small squads, using ladders, debris piles, and partially destroyed stairwells to gain elevation. Each room cleared demanded extreme caution, as German defenders often waited in hiding for moments to ambush attackers. Explosions of grenades and rifle fire echoed through the skeletal structure, while fires consumed wooden flooring and remaining furniture. Soviet engineers removed or neutralized barricades, facilitating movement between floors while under constant threat. The psychological weight of the mission was immense. Soldiers knew the act of raising the banner would signal not just victory, but the collapse of the Nazi regime. Despite exhaustion, fear, and casualties, squads pushed upward, coordinated by officers who communicated through shouts, signals, and gestures. German resistance, though fragmented, was fanatical, with each defender knowing that the fall of the Reichstag could mean death or capture. The interior of the building became a maze of firefights, with each floor a deadly arena requiring tactical acumen and personal courage. Every inch gained toward the roof was a hard-fought step toward symbolic and strategic victory. Vistula. Finally, the red banner was raised atop the Reichstag's dome, a moment immortalized as the symbol of Soviet triumph over Nazi Germany. The act itself, however, was not free from danger, as sniper fire and artillery continued to threaten the summit and surrounding rooftop. Soldiers held the flag aloft amidst smoke, dust, and the sound of distant explosions, aware that the gesture would resonate across the world. Inside, resistance continued sporadically, with isolated German pockets fighting to the last breath, but the symbolic and practical dominance of the Soviets was undeniable. The building, battered and scarred, had survived intense artillery, infantry assaults, and structural collapses, yet now stood as a captured prize. Engineers and infantry worked together to secure entrances, remove remaining booby traps, and consolidate positions, transforming the building from fortress to Soviet stronghold. Street-level combat continued in the surrounding avenues, but momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the Red Army. Communication between units became more organized once the main floors were secured, allowing for systematic clearing of residual resistance. Civilian witnesses, from hidden shelters or distant vantage points, observed the banner, understanding its profound symbolic significance. The capture of the Reichstag marked both a strategic and psychological turning point, signifying the imminent end of the Nazi regime. The fighting inside the Reichstag highlighted the brutal nature of urban warfare, where small unit tactics, improvisation, and personal courage determined outcomes in confined spaces. Soviet soldiers navigated collapsed walls, ceilings weakened by artillery, and barricaded doorways while engaging in continuous firefights with fanatical defenders. Explosions and gunfire created a claustrophobic, chaotic environment where visibility, coordination, and situational awareness were constantly challenged. Panzerfausts, grenades, and machine guns claimed casualties on both sides, transforming the interior into a deadly maze. Each floor cleared allowed Soviet units to bring reinforcements and supplies upward, gradually tipping the balance of power. German defenders, though increasingly diminished in number, continued to resist from hidden alcoves, stairwells, and partially destroyed chambers. The psychological strain on soldiers, facing death, fire, and destruction at every step, was immense. Commanders coordinated movement and suppression tactics, using smoke, gunfire, and grenades to systematically eliminate resistance. Casualty evacuation was improvisational, often requiring fellow soldiers to drag wounded comrades through debris-strewn corridors. The Reichstag, once a symbol of German legislative power, had been transformed into an arena of lethal urban combat, its capture marking the culmination of the battle for Berlin. By May 1, 1945, with the red banner firmly planted and the Reichstag cleared of major resistance, the building became the epicenter of Soviet control in central Berlin. Mopping up operations continued inside, with engineers dismantling booby traps and soldiers securing the remaining floors and corridors. The symbolic significance of the capture reverberated across the city, bolstering Soviet morale and signaling the effective collapse of German resistance. Remaining defenders either surrendered, fled, or were killed in pockets of desperate resistance. The streets around the Reichstag, still littered with rubble, fire, and corpses, reflected the cost of the brutal urban battle. Command and communication among Soviet units stabilized, allowing for systematic consolidation of territory in central Berlin. Civilian observers, emerging cautiously from shelters, saw the building as the definitive marker of the Nazi regime's end. Reports and photographs of the raised red banner would later be circulated worldwide, immortalizing the moment of symbolic victory. Inside, soldiers paused to catch their breath, clean weapons, and tend to the wounded, aware that while the Reichstag had fallen, pockets of resistance remained elsewhere in the city. In the immediate aftermath of the Reichstag's capture, the reality of total defeat swept through the remnants of German forces, triggering waves of surrender across Berlin. Soldiers who had clung to ideology, fear, or delusion now faced the stark choice of life or death, and tens of thousands chose to lay down arms. Streets previously dominated by chaotic firefights were now filled with groups of exhausted, disoriented troops, emerging from basements, rubble-strewn shelters, and fortified positions. Volkssturm battalions, often composed of elderly men and barely trained teenagers, presented themselves in confused clusters, surrendering to Soviet troops with hands raised or waving white cloths improvised from torn clothing. Communication between pockets of resistance broke down entirely, leaving units unaware of others' actions and accelerating collapse. Soviet soldiers, wary yet disciplined, processed surrendering troops, disarming them and gathering information about remaining German positions. The psychological impact of surrender was profound, as exhausted soldiers confronted the futility of continued resistance, and officers realized that coordinated command had disintegrated completely. Civilians cautiously re-emerged, witnessing columns of defeated troops, the sheer scale of surrender reinforcing the visual narrative of a collapsing regime. Amid rubble, burning vehicles, and shattered buildings, the city's chaotic energy shifted from desperate defense to controlled containment of prisoners. Each captured group contributed to the broader picture of mass collapse, illustrating both the human and organizational unraveling of the Third Reich. German officers attempted to salvage authority amidst the widespread capitulation, but efforts were largely futile, as surrender overtook structured command. Fragmented Wehrmacht units, separated by artillery-damaged streets and demolished bridges, could not reorganize effectively, and morale plummeted further with each passing hour. SS leaders, who had previously enforced fanatical loyalty, were forced to confront the practical impossibility of maintaining resistance. Isolated pockets of Hitler Youth and Volkssturm tried to maintain order, but exhaustion, lack of supplies, and overwhelming enemy presence made sustained defense unrealistic. Reports of surrender in adjacent sectors amplified panic and created a domino effect, with hesitant units deciding to capitulate rather than face inevitable annihilation. Soviet forces methodically secured streets, intersections, and strategic buildings, isolating remaining defenders and controlling routes of escape. Prisoner collection points became crowded with soldiers, many of whom had been engaged in continuous combat for days, now collapsing physically and psychologically under the weight of defeat. Officers attempting to resist surrender faced mutiny from within their own ranks, as individual soldiers prioritized survival over ideology. Communication between German commands was virtually non-existent, leaving no possibility for coordinated countermeasures or tactical retreats. The psychological and operational breakdown combined to accelerate the mass capitulation of forces throughout central Berlin. Sendershaushalsey. Urban geography played a crucial role in the dynamics of surrender, as heavily damaged streets funneled retreating soldiers towards Soviet positions. Debris, rubble, and collapsed structures created natural choke points, where disoriented troops were forced into concentrated groups, simplifying capture for advancing units. Tank tracks and artillery craters scarred avenues, compelling soldiers to move through predictable paths that exposed them to Soviet observation and controlled fire. Confused Volkssturm units, many elderly or injured, followed younger conscripts and Hitler Youth under the assumption that someone knew the correct course of action. Crowded intersections became temporary holding areas, where surrendering soldiers were disarmed, interrogated, and segregated according to rank and combat unit. The visual scale of surrender, columns of defeated troops moving slowly through devastated streets, reinforced the symbolic collapse of the German war effort. Civilians observed, often silently, as columns passed, many taking note of exhausted youth and frail elderly conscripts who had been forced into combat. The tactical advantage shifted entirely to the Soviets, who used the constrained urban landscape to neutralize remaining resistance systematically. Temporary command posts were established along main routes to manage the flow of prisoners and monitor potential stragglers. Each captured pocket represented not just a tactical victory, but a psychological reinforcement of the inevitability of Germany's defeat. Amid the widespread surrender, chaos persisted in isolated sectors where communication had not yet reached, resulting in sporadic clashes and confusion. Small groups of die-hard SS officers and committed Hitler Youth attempted counterattacks, unaware that surrounding units had capitulated or fled. Sporadic gunfire erupted in buildings already considered under Soviet control, often originating from hidden cellars or barricaded stairwells. Explosions from abandoned explosives, grenades, and artillery shells continued to endanger both attackers and surrendering soldiers. Conflicting signals created hesitation, as some units refused to leave positions without orders, while others fled blindly toward advancing Soviet columns. Civilian populations navigated the chaos cautiously, with many avoiding streets entirely and seeking temporary refuge in basements or surviving structures. Soviet commanders adapted quickly, prioritizing containment, crowd control, and the neutralization of isolated resistance pockets. Psychological operations, including loudspeaker announcements and distribution of leaflets, reinforced surrender incentives, encouraging soldiers to lay down arms voluntarily. The combination of systematic Soviet strategy and German disorganization transformed residual chaos into controlled surrender. Each act of capitulation further demoralized remaining pockets, accelerating the end of armed resistance in the city. The psychological toll on German troops was extraordinary, as exhaustion, hunger, fear, and constant bombardment left soldiers physically and mentally drained. Some soldiers displayed visible signs of trauma, shaking hands, vacant stares, and hesitant movement as they approached Soviet lines. Officers attempted to maintain discipline, but lack of communication and collapsing hierarchy rendered such efforts largely symbolic. In some cases, soldiers abandoned weapons voluntarily before reaching enemy lines, driven by survival instincts rather than ideological calculation. Local civilians sometimes guided retreating troops to surrender points, knowing that these individuals posed less threat when managed systematically. Prisoner processing was labor-intensive, with Soviet units registering, disarming, and segregating captives while maintaining security along the streets. The scale of surrender required logistical coordination, including the management of rations, temporary shelters, and control over stragglers who attempted to flee. Psychological operations continued to be employed, with loudspeakers broadcasting assurances and instructions to dishearten German soldiers. The combination of fear, fatigue, and overwhelming force produced surrender on a massive scale, leaving few German troops capable of organized resistance. Each wave of capitulation reinforced the impression of unstoppable Soviet dominance and the total collapse of German military control. DSO. Volkssturm units, composed largely of men over 60 or young teenagers, surrendered en masse as their improvised defenses collapsed. Many had been forced into combat with minimal training and rudimentary weapons, and the intensity of urban combat shattered their limited cohesion. Groups moved slowly, often guided by surviving officers or civilians, toward centralized surrender points established by Soviet units. Some attempted to resist briefly, motivated by fear of shame or ideological indoctrination, but were quickly overwhelmed by numerical superiority and heavy firepower. Families of combatants, where present, followed along streets in tense silence, adding to the human complexity of surrender operations. The logistical challenge for Soviet forces was immense, requiring systematic disarmament, registration, and management of prisoners, while simultaneously securing remaining sectors. Physical exhaustion, injuries, and psychological trauma caused some prisoners to collapse during processing, necessitating immediate care or evacuation. The surrender of Volkssturm units marked a symbolic and practical collapse of the regime's last defensive line. Soviet troops often treated compliant prisoners with measured discipline, emphasizing control over revenge in order to stabilize captured areas. The mass surrender of irregular forces demonstrated the complete erosion of Nazi command and the futility of continued resistance. Simultaneously, elite SS and remaining Wehrmacht soldiers faced the stark choice of surrender or annihilation. Some attempted to escape through rubble-strewn streets or sewers, only to be captured by Soviet patrols or redirected toward holding areas. Others engaged in isolated firefights before capitulating, often after suffering heavy casualties that rendered further resistance meaningless. Confusion, miscommunication, and fatigue further eroded any semblance of tactical cohesion among surviving units. Soviet forces exploited urban choke points, streets, and barricades to funnel surrendering troops into controlled areas, minimizing further resistance and casualties. Each day the scale of capitulation grew, with prisoners outnumbering combatants still willing to fight. Officers who had maintained discipline found themselves powerless against the momentum of mass surrender, watching as the very units they commanded dissolved into captured ranks. The chaos of retreat, combined with the strategic pressure of encirclement, rendered any remaining defensive plans irrelevant. The collapse of morale and the physical strain of continuous combat created an environment where surrender became the rational, if terrifying, choice. Streets, courtyards, and former strongpoints became filled with a mixture of disarmed soldiers, rubble, and the detritus of prolonged urban warfare. By early May 1945, the mass surrender of German forces in Berlin was essentially complete, leaving only small, isolated pockets of resistance scattered across the devastated city. Soviet troops, consolidating control, organized prisoners, secured strategic points, and eliminated remaining threats methodically. The psychological impact on both the victors and the vanquished was immense, as tens of thousands of soldiers processed the transition from combatants to captives. Civilians cautiously emerged from shelters to witness the aftermath, seeing streets filled with disarmed soldiers, destroyed vehicles, and the remnants of barricaded strongpoints. The collapse of command, loss of ideological cohesion, and overwhelming force had produced a scale of surrender unprecedented in urban warfare. Remaining German units, largely leaderless and exhausted, offered little organized resistance, completing the transformation of Berlin from a battleground to a controlled occupation zone. Soviet forces continued mop-up operations, systematically clearing buildings, alleys, and barricaded positions to prevent sporadic counterattacks. The sheer scale of mass surrender reinforced the historical significance of Berlin's fall, symbolizing the definitive end of Nazi military power. Exhaustion, trauma, and chaos dominated the immediate human experience, as prisoners, civilians, and soldiers alike navigated the ruins of the city. The mass capitulation, both strategic and psychological, marked the irreversible collapse of German resistance, setting the stage for the final occupation and post-war reckoning. As the Battle of Berlin drew to a close, the city's civilian population bore the brunt of relentless urban warfare, suffering starvation, injury, and psychological trauma on a scale almost unimaginable. Food shortages, already severe from years of blockade and bombardment, reached catastrophic levels as supply lines collapsed completely. Families scavenged through ruined markets, burned warehouses, and abandoned homes, desperate to find even the smallest morsel to stave off hunger. Water became scarce, and contaminated sources contributed to outbreaks of disease, further weakening an already exhausted populace. Bombed-out buildings became both refuge and prison, as collapsing structures offered temporary shelter while trapping civilians in dangerous zones. Fear permeated the streets, as citizens navigated alleys and rubble-strewn avenues, unsure whether to hide, flee, or seek aid from advancing troops. Many civilians were injured by stray artillery, collapsing walls, or unexploded ordnance, overwhelming makeshift medical stations struggling to cope. Psychological strain was pervasive. Children, elderly, and families faced constant terror from gunfire, explosions, and the unpredictable behavior of both soldiers and desperate neighbors. Looting and opportunistic violence exacerbated the chaos, blurring the lines between survival and crime. The city, once a bustling capital, had become a landscape of despair, where every step was a reminder of relentless human suffering. Beyond the physical hardships, civilians endured atrocities perpetrated by both desperate defenders and invading forces, with countless acts of cruelty leaving lasting scars. Reports emerged of arbitrary executions, beatings, and sexual violence committed in the frenzy of collapse, further terrorizing the population. Women and children were particularly vulnerable, often trapped in shattered buildings, while soldiers sought to assert control or revenge. Families attempted to shield each other, forming protective clusters in cellars and bombed-out apartments. Yet even the most cautious precautions could not prevent tragedy. Streets and courtyards became temporary morgues, as corpses of both civilians and soldiers littered the rubble, a grim reminder of the indiscriminate nature of urban combat. Starvation compounded these horrors, with malnourished civilians weakened to the point of immobility, unable to flee or protect themselves from opportunistic violence. Hospitals and clinics, already overwhelmed, collapsed under the influx of wounded civilians and soldiers, leaving many without care. Fire, both from artillery and scorched defense efforts, consumed entire blocks, destroying homes, belongings, and the last vestiges of community life. Looting and desperation created moral dilemmas for the surviving population, forcing choices between survival and solidarity. The human cost of the battle extended far beyond the front lines, infiltrating every home, street, and shelter with fear, deprivation, and loss. Starvation emerged as one of the most pervasive and brutal consequences for Berlin's civilians. As the siege conditions made food a daily struggle for survival, ration cards became worthless in the absence of supplies, and foraging through destroyed infrastructure became the only viable option. Children and the elderly were often prioritized in families' scavenging efforts, but scarcity meant that many still went hungry for days at a time. Malnutrition weakened the population, increasing vulnerability to disease and reducing resilience against both environmental and psychological stresses. Community networks, informal aid groups, and neighborly exchanges attempted to mitigate hunger, but the sheer scale of deprivation rendered such efforts insufficient. Cooking fires became rare, as fuel was scarce and fire risk high amidst the rubble. Desperation led some civilians to consume contaminated food or unorthodox sources of sustenance, risking illness and death. Starvation heightened tension within families and neighborhoods, occasionally leading to conflict over remaining resources. Soviet forces, upon entering the city, encountered civilians in skeletal condition, a shocking testament to months of siege, bombardment, and deprivation. Each hungry, exhausted face reflected the profound human suffering that occurred parallel to the military narrative of Berlin's fall. The destruction of infrastructure intensified civilian suffering, as electricity, water, and sanitation systems had been obliterated by relentless artillery and bombing. Streets were blocked with rubble, burned-out vehicles, and collapsed buildings, making movement hazardous and access to aid nearly impossible. Hospitals, schools, and community centers had been reduced to skeletons of walls and foundations, stripping civilians of the last functional shelters. Fire had consumed entire districts, leaving survivors exposed to the elements, while winter approached, threatening hypothermia and further disease. Water pipes, ruptured and contaminated, forced residents to rely on rainwater, melted snow, or polluted streams, worsening hygiene and spreading illness. Public services, from waste collection to emergency response, had completely ceased, leaving corpses, debris, and toxic materials to accumulate unchecked. Survivors were forced to navigate this hostile landscape daily, balancing the search for food, water, and safety against the risk of injury or death. Temporary shelters were overcrowded, unsanitary, and vulnerable to opportunistic crime or the random collapse of unstable buildings. This environment of extreme deprivation and danger compounded the psychological toll, leaving civilians in a state of constant fear, exhaustion, and helplessness. The ruined cityscape became a cage, trapping its population in an unending cycle of scarcity, terror, and survival. Atrocities by occupying forces further compounded civilian trauma, introducing a climate of terror and unpredictability into the city. Soviet troops, while asserting military control, committed acts of vengeance and retribution against both male and female civilians perceived to be complicit with the Nazi regime. Looting, sexual violence, and summary executions created an environment where survival depended as much on discretion as on strength or resourcefulness. German women faced particular vulnerability, with some resorting to hiding in basements, attics, or secret passages to avoid predation. Children witnessed violence firsthand, shaping a generation marked by fear and the trauma of war's end. Elderly civilians, unable to flee or protect themselves, were disproportionately affected, often left alone amidst devastation and predation. Informal networks of mutual aid emerged despite the dangers, with families and neighbors attempting to shield each other from abuse. Psychological scars compounded physical suffering, leaving survivors grappling with guilt, grief, and the relentless memory of violence. These atrocities blurred the line between victors and victims, highlighting the complex human cost of occupation and revenge. Berlin's population endured the dual impact of military destruction and human cruelty, a combination that would leave permanent social and cultural scars. Mass displacement became another defining feature of civilian suffering, as entire families abandoned, destroyed neighborhoods in search of relative safety. Streets were clogged with carts, makeshift stretchers, and travelers carrying the remnants of their lives. Movement was perilous, with ongoing sporadic fighting, unexploded ordnance, and collapsing structures posing constant threats. Crowds often converged on temporary relief centers, where resources were meager and conditions overcrowded. Disease outbreaks spread rapidly in these temporary encampments, fueled by close quarters malnutrition and lack of sanitation. Children, separated from parents in the chaos, faced extreme vulnerability, with orphaned youth navigating a devastated city with little guidance. Elderly residents struggled to keep pace or carry essential belongings, leaving many to lag behind and become isolated. Families formed ad hoc caravans, sharing resources and protection in a desperate bid to survive. The psychological strain of constant movement, coupled with exposure to violence and deprivation, created a population on the brink of collapse. Every step outside shelter became a calculated risk, highlighting the pervasive danger and despair faced by civilians during Berlin's final days. Disease and medical collapse further exacerbated civilian suffering, as hospitals were overwhelmed, supply chains destroyed, and medical personnel scarce. Wounded civilians often went untreated or received only rudimentary care in improvised infirmaries. Infectious diseases spread rapidly in overcrowded basements and improvised shelters, compounded by malnutrition and unsanitary conditions. Epidemics of typhus, dysentery, and respiratory illnesses claimed countless lives, particularly among children and the elderly. Surgical and pharmaceutical supplies were exhausted, leaving caregivers improvising with minimal tools and knowledge. Water contamination and lack of proper sanitation accelerated the spread of disease, creating a secondary wave of suffering beyond immediate combat injuries. Civilians weakened by starvation were more susceptible to illness, creating a cycle of decline that few could escape. Soviet medical units attempted to provide relief, but the sheer scale of need outstripped available resources. Makeshift hospitals became hubs of both hope and despair, as some patients recovered while others succumbed to illness. Each illness, untreated wound, or infection highlighted the compounded toll of warfare, occupation, and deprivation on Berlin's civilian population. By the conclusion of the battle, Berlin's civilian population had endured unprecedented levels of suffering, a human cost intertwined with the city's military collapse. Starvation, disease, violence, and displacement had decimated communities and fractured social cohesion. Children, women, and the elderly bore the brunt of this devastation, often relying on courage, improvisation, and solidarity to survive. Survivors were left navigating a landscape of destroyed homes, burned streets, and lingering death, their resilience tested by the enormity of loss. Stories of bravery, endurance, and compassion emerged amid the chaos, offering a glimpse of humanity amidst relentless despair. The scale of civilian suffering became a crucial part of the historical narrative of Berlin's fall, demonstrating that war's impact extends far beyond soldiers and combatants. Relief efforts, both immediate and long-term, faced monumental challenges in addressing hunger, injury, and psychological trauma. The memory of these civilians' experiences would endure, shaping both historical understanding and cultural memory of the battle. Each survivor carried the physical and emotional scars of conflict, a living testament to the devastating cost of urban warfare. The fate of Berlin's civilians encapsulated the total collapse of a city, reflecting the profound intersection of human suffering and military destruction. As the ruins of Berlin smoldered, the remnants of the German High Command faced the inevitable surrender to the Allies, ending a war that had devastated Europe for 6 long years. The signing of the unconditional surrender was preceded by frantic communications, last-minute consultations, and the collapse of any remaining military cohesion. In the charred corridors of the Führerbunker, officers wrestled with disbelief, shame, and the weight of responsibility, fully aware that the Reich they had served so fanatically was gone. Soviet forces controlled the city, their armored divisions threading through broken streets, while Allied forces in the west tightened the encirclement. The surrender negotiations were meticulous, reflecting both the urgency to end hostilities and the symbolic importance of formal capitulation. German envoys were instructed to negotiate terms without delay, carrying the signatures of a defeated command that still clung to fragments of pride. The mood in Karlshorst, the site of the surrender ceremony, was tense. Soviet officers prepared meticulously, aware that the act would mark the culmination of their bloody and costly push into the heart of Germany. Maps, documents, and orders littered the room, a testament to the meticulous planning that had once governed armies now rendered obsolete. Journalists and observers noted the surreal contrast between the grand military formality and the stark reality outside, where civilians and soldiers alike navigated a city reduced to rubble. The surrender represented both an end and a beginning, the cessation of fighting and the start of a complicated occupation. On May 8, 1945, the world would witness the formal capitulation of the Third Reich, a moment that had been anticipated but still carried enormous weight. Representatives of the German High Command, including General Wilhelm Keitel, presented themselves before Soviet, British, and American commanders, tasked with signing documents that would codify the end of hostilities. Keitel, once a figure of unyielding authority, signed with trembling hands, aware that he was legitimizing the defeat of a regime built on ideology and terror. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov oversaw the proceedings, his presence a stark reminder of the blood paid by the Red Army to reach this moment. The documents enumerated obligations, cessation of military operations, disarmament, and the unconditional compliance of all German forces. Allied commanders scrutinized the signatures, ensuring legal precision while recognizing the historical magnitude of the act. Beyond the walls of Karlshorst, Berlin's civilians remained amid devastation, the distant sounds of artillery and firefights fading but never fully silenced. Soldiers, whether SS, Wehrmacht, or Volkssturm, confronted a mixture of relief, fear, and uncertainty as the reality of surrender sank in. The surrender was broadcast and reported across Europe, bringing relief to occupied nations and a profound reckoning for Germany itself. In these moments, the enormity of collapse, the human cost, and the scale of destruction were made unmistakably clear. The surrender in Karlshorst was meticulously documented, reflecting both military precision and symbolic significance, intended to demonstrate the comprehensive defeat of Germany. Every paragraph of the capitulation text was debated, ensuring clarity in obligations, timelines, and enforcement mechanisms. The Germans, despite their weakened position, sought to retain some dignity and formal acknowledgement of rank and status in the surrender process. Soviet forces demanded strict adherence, recognizing that the paperwork would serve as both historical record and legal basis for occupation policies. The Allied representatives, British and American, carefully observed, noting not only the military compliance, but also the psychological surrender of a command that had once projected invincibility. Outside, Berlin's streets bore witness to the human toll of resistance, with thousands of exhausted soldiers and civilians pausing in confusion and relief. The documents themselves were signed in triplicate, each copy intended for meticulous record-keeping and verification. Orders immediately flowed to subordinate units, instructing German forces to cease fire, surrender weapons, and report movements to Allied authorities. The process, though bureaucratic, carried profound moral and historical implications, symbolizing the totality of defeat. The signing represented the formal conclusion of organized German resistance, even as sporadic pockets of combat persisted in isolated districts. The capitulation marked a turning point not only militarily, but psychologically, both for the defeated Germans and the victorious Allies. Soldiers accustomed to obedience and discipline confronted the disorienting reality of surrender, where authority had dissolved and survival became paramount. Civilians, many having suffered starvation, bombings, and violence, were unsure how to navigate the new power structures imposed by the occupiers. The signing ceremony was emblematic. The meticulous, formal, almost ceremonial act contrasted sharply with the chaos in the streets outside. Soviet troops entered Karlshorst with precision, ensuring order while projecting authority, their demeanor a combination of triumph and vigilance. The German envoys were closely monitored, their actions and demeanor noted for both legal accountability and historical record. News of the surrender reverberated across Germany, bringing both relief and shock as the reality of unconditional defeat permeated the population. In occupied cities, local administrators were replaced, laws rewritten, and daily life reoriented under Allied directives. The surrender codified the end of German military organization, but also initiated complex occupation logistics, including disarmament, repatriation of prisoners, and stabilization of civilian populations. This chapter of capitulation was simultaneously the close of war and the opening act of post-war reconstruction. As ponder, communications between Berlin's remaining military leaders and Karlshorst were fraught with urgency and confusion, as news of surrender reached fragmented units at different times. German commanders, often isolated or cut off by the Soviet advance, struggled to reconcile orders from a leadership that no longer had control of the city. Messages ordering continued resistance were overridden by the legal authority of the surrender, creating confusion among frontline soldiers and SS units. Many units, trapped in destroyed districts or surrounded by advancing troops, capitulated only after brief negotiation, realizing that further combat was futile. Civilians, eager for the cessation of violence, frequently acted as intermediaries, guiding troops to collection points or relief centers. Soviet and Allied forces coordinated occupation zones, ensuring that German compliance was enforceable and that remaining combatants were processed appropriately. The process of surrendering troops was fraught with human emotion, fear, shame, relief, and anger, mixed in the faces of soldiers who had witnessed the collapse of the Third Reich. Even after the signing, isolated skirmishes continued in Berlin's Rubble, a testament to both communication breakdown and the chaos of urban warfare. The capitulation was not instantaneous across the city, but unfolded over hours and days as the reality of defeat reached every corner. Each surrendering soldier contributed to the broader mosaic of compliance that solidified the end of German organized military resistance. The surrender had profound implications for Berlin's civilian population, who had endured months of bombardment, starvation, and terror. With the formal end of hostilities, the immediate threat of combat ceased, yet dangers remained from unexploded ordnance, fires, and opportunistic violence. Relief distribution, medical aid, and restoration of basic services became priorities for both Soviet authorities and emerging civilian networks. Families emerged cautiously from basements and shelters, confronting the full scale of devastation around them. Streets littered with debris, corpses, and the remnants of war made navigation hazardous and psychologically harrowing. Reports of abuses, looting, and retributive violence by occupying troops created an uneasy environment, complicating the process of adaptation. Despite this, the surrender marked the beginning of tangible relief, as food, water, and medical aid slowly reached the city's inhabitants. The psychological impact of capitulation was immediate. Terror shifted from external bombardment to coping with occupation and the monumental task of survival in ruins. The surrender represented both hope and challenge, ending one form of violence while opening a new chapter of uncertainty. Berlin's civilians, weary and traumatized, began to reconcile with the consequences of years of total war, destruction, and authoritarian collapse. The historical significance of the unconditional surrender extended beyond immediate military considerations, serving as a defining moment for post-war Europe. Documentation of the act provided legal and moral clarity, establishing the Third Reich's official collapse and setting the stage for occupation policies. The proceedings at Karlshorst were carefully chronicled by both Allied and German sources, ensuring a detailed record for posterity and accountability. This surrender underscored the totality of defeat: no negotiation, no compromise, and no conditional terms, only unconditional compliance. Political implications extended to Berlin's administration, where Allied authorities assumed control over governance, infrastructure, and civilian management. The surrender also signaled to other German forces still scattered across Europe that further resistance was futile, facilitating the end of hostilities across remaining occupied territories. Berlin became both a symbol of military defeat and a focal point for post-war planning, reconstruction, and trials of those responsible for the war. Military historians would later analyze Karlshorst as the definitive closure of European combat in World War II. The city's fall, formalized through surrender, transformed Berlin from capital of a conquering empire to a landscape of occupation, recovery, and reckoning. The act at Karlshorst thus embodied not only military submission, but also the broader collapse of Nazi Germany's political, social, and moral structures. In the aftermath of the signing, German officers and officials faced immediate consequences: detainment, disarmament, and processing under Allied supervision. Many were interned as prisoners of war, while others awaited potential trials for war crimes, a harbinger of the Nuremberg processes that would follow. The surrender also provided a foundation for the systematic occupation, enabling Allied authorities to stabilize Berlin, collect documentation, and manage displaced populations. Civilians cautiously began to resume basic routines, scavenging for supplies, and attempting to reconstruct some semblance of normal life amidst devastation. Soviet forces, now firmly in control, organized security, rationing, and order, while occasionally engaging in punitive measures against perceived collaborators. Communication with other Allied sectors, ensured coordinated efforts in disarmament and control across Germany. The symbolic and practical implications of the surrender were inseparable. It represented both the end of military opposition and the beginning of a prolonged occupation that would shape post-war Europe. Berlin itself, a city that had epitomized Nazi power, now became a testing ground for governance, reconstruction, and reconciliation. The unconditional surrender codified the final chapter of active conflict in Germany, leaving a profound imprint on soldiers, civilians, and the trajectory of European history. Through the formal act at Karlshorst, the Third Reich was rendered legally, militarily, and symbolically defunct, marking the definitive conclusion of its destructive war. The Battle of Berlin left the German capital in ruins, a shattered monument to the final throes of a collapsing regime. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, streets pockmarked by shell craters, and buildings gutted by fire or artillery bombardment. Landmarks that had once symbolized power and pride, the Reichstag, the Brandenburg Gate, and the city's grand boulevards, stood scarred and skeletal, testaments to the ferocity of urban combat. Estimates of casualties were staggering, hundreds of thousands of soldiers dead, wounded, or missing, with the civilian toll equally horrifying, reflecting indiscriminate bombing, artillery fire, and street-to-street fighting. The Volkssturm and Hitler Youth, untrained and desperate, had been thrown into the fray, suffering immense losses that highlighted both the regime's fanaticism and the human cost of ideological obsession. Soviet and German historians alike would later debate precise figures, but the scale of death and destruction was undeniable, leaving Berlin unrecognizable as a functioning city. The psychological impact on survivors was profound, with trauma etched into every face, every collapsed building, and every scarred street corner. Families were decimated, entire blocks depopulated, and the social fabric irreparably torn, marking a generational trauma that would endure long after the guns fell silent. Looting, fires, and chaos compounded the physical devastation, making basic survival a daily struggle for the population that remained. The city, once a symbol of Nazi power, had become a grim warning of the consequences of total war and ideological extremism. The human cost of the battle extended far beyond Berlin's borders, encompassing the final waves of German defenders and the advancing Soviet forces. Soviet casualties were immense, with tens of thousands killed or wounded in relentless assaults across fortified districts, open squares, and rubble-strewn streets. German military casualties were equally catastrophic, including remnants of the Wehrmacht, SS, and hastily conscripted Volkssturm units. The battle's ferocity reflected years of brutal conditioning, where both sides had learned the lethality of urban combat and refused to yield territory. For civilians, the dangers were omnipresent. Artillery shells fell without warning, snipers hunted from ruined buildings, and fires consumed homes and livelihoods. Starvation and disease compounded the suffering, as food, clean water, and medical care were scarce or non-existent. The mass displacement of Berliners created chaos, with families forced to navigate streets full of debris and the remnants of collapsing infrastructure. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and makeshift shelters became temporary graves for those who could not escape the violence. This human catastrophe was both immediate and enduring, shaping post-war narratives, memorials, and collective memory. The Battle of Berlin thus became a symbol not only of military collapse, but of the immense price paid by ordinary people caught in the crossfire. The physical destruction of Berlin also carried immense symbolic weight, representing the downfall of a regime that had spread terror across Europe. Once the epicenter of Nazi authority, The capital's ruin underscored the complete failure of Hitler's promises of invincibility and national glory. Cultural landmarks, administrative centers, and residential districts alike bore the scars of relentless bombardment and house-to-house fighting. The Reichstag, in particular, became emblematic of both defeat and victory, its battered facade standing as a testament to the cost of ideological extremism. Bridges, railways, and roads lay in ruins, severing supply lines and making reconstruction an almost unimaginable task. The scale of urban destruction forced planners, engineers, and the occupying authorities to confront the enormity of post-war rebuilding. Beyond architecture, the destruction disrupted social networks, public institutions, and municipal governance, leaving a vacuum filled by occupation authorities and emergency administrators. Photographs and first-hand accounts from the period capture the devastation with a stark realism, highlighting collapsed walls, charred interiors, and the skeletal remains of everyday life. In this physical devastation, the symbolic collapse of the Third Reich was cemented, leaving Berlin a ruin and a warning to future generations. The city's fall marked the final act of a regime that had once projected power across Europe, but now lay in ashes. The strategic impact of the Battle of Berlin was decisive, ending organized German resistance and signaling the war's conclusion in Europe. The fall of the capital eliminated remaining pockets of command, severed communications, and accelerated the surrender of isolated units across Germany. Allied forces, already poised on multiple fronts, interpreted Berlin's capture as both a military and psychological victory. The capitulation at Karlshorst formalized this end, leaving no ambiguity about the Third Reich's collapse. Remaining German forces in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Western Germany quickly acknowledged the futility of further resistance, surrendering to advancing Soviet or Western units. The battle's timing ensured that the war's European theater concluded within days, allowing for immediate focus on occupation, reconstruction, and addressing war crimes. The significance of Berlin's fall extended beyond military calculations, shaping political negotiations and the eventual division of Germany. The Red Army's prestige was elevated, demonstrating the effectiveness of massed forces, combined arms, and relentless persistence. Western allies recognized the strategic necessity but deferred to Soviet control over the city, foreshadowing post-war divisions. In every sense, Berlin's destruction and the surrender of its defenders marked the definitive end of Hitler's Europe. The psychological legacy of the battle was equally profound, impacting survivors, veterans, and the collective European consciousness. For German civilians, trauma was immediate, witnessing friends, neighbors, and family perish, navigating bombed-out streets, and enduring occupation left indelible scars. Soviet soldiers, having paid a high price to capture the city, were marked by both pride in victory and the memories of extreme carnage. Returning soldiers in Western Europe confronted a continent fundamentally altered by 6 years of conflict, with Berlin's fall serving as the stark symbol of total defeat. The psychological collapse of Nazi officials who had anticipated triumph or honorable surrender amplified the aura of chaos and despair. Propaganda, previously unchallenged within Germany, proved irrelevant against the stark reality of destruction and occupation. Public morale, long manipulated for war purposes, gave way to survival instincts and the need to rebuild lives from ruins. Post-war narratives framed the battle as both heroic and tragic, depending on perspective, underscoring the complex human and moral dimensions of warfare. Memoirs, letters, and testimonies, from civilians and soldiers alike, highlight the emotional weight of street-to-street combat, fear of reprisals, and the unrelenting struggle to endure. The Battle of Berlin, therefore, became a psychological benchmark, representing the ultimate consequences of fanaticism, total war, and ideological extremism. Its memory would inform literature, films, and collective understanding of the war for decades. The civilian infrastructure collapse had lasting consequences, influencing post-war recovery and urban planning. Utilities such as electricity, water, and sanitation were largely destroyed, making immediate post-war life chaotic and hazardous. Hospitals struggled to treat the wounded and dying, often lacking basic supplies and medical personnel, many of whom had perished or fled. Schools, government offices, and commercial establishments were destroyed, disrupting social order and economic activity. The rubble-strewn streets delayed transportation, commerce, and the re-establishment of supply lines necessary for survival. Public morale was low, with food shortages, harsh winters, and limited shelter compounding the suffering. Allied and Soviet authorities faced enormous challenges in restoring basic services, distributing aid, and preventing disease outbreaks. The social fabric, weakened by death and displacement, required deliberate efforts to rebuild community networks, administration, and law enforcement. Berlin's destruction became a case study in urban resilience, illustrating how cities could be both devastated and reborn. The battle's physical and logistical impact demonstrated that the cost of ideological extremism was not only measured in lives lost, but in the erasure of civilization itself. Military historians note that the battle's scale exemplified the destructive potential of combined arms and urban warfare. Soviet artillery, air power, and infantry assaults created near-total devastation, while German defensive tactics prolonged street-to-street combat. Snipers, barricades, and improvised explosives transformed familiar city streets into deadly arenas. Armored vehicles, tanks, and self-propelled artillery were as likely to destroy civilian structures as military targets, reflecting the indiscriminate nature of urban warfare. The human cost for both attackers and defenders underscored the lethal efficiency of modern combined arms operations. Logistics, communications, and morale all played pivotal roles in determining how long German resistance could persist amidst overwhelming opposition. Even as the Red Army advanced methodically, the battle revealed the limits of military technology against determined urban defenders. Scholars point to Berlin as a culmination of lessons learned throughout Eastern Front urban engagements, including Stalingrad and Warsaw. The city's fall demonstrated both strategic brilliance and the tragic cost of tactical decisions when civilians are caught in the crossfire. In historical analysis, Berlin stands as a defining example of the brutality and consequences of modern total war. Ultimately, the Battle of Berlin cemented the end of World War II in Europe, while leaving a legacy of destruction, death, and reflection. The city's ruins were a constant reminder of the human, material, and cultural cost of fanaticism and war. Casualties on all sides highlighted the futility of prolonged resistance in the face of overwhelming force. The surrender formalized at Karlshorst gave legal closure, but did not erase the suffering or devastation experienced by soldiers and civilians alike. Berlin's destruction became a symbol for post-war reconstruction, memorialization, and the moral reckoning of Europe. Survivors carried memories of fear, courage, loss, and survival, shaping personal and collective histories. The psychological and societal scars endured for decades, influencing literature, art, and political discourse. Military and strategic lessons informed post-war planning, urban defense theories, and peacekeeping doctrines. Berlin's fall also marked the definitive collapse of Nazi authority, providing a clear endpoint to European hostilities. In sum, the Battle of Berlin remains,